Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video.
To Alaric, the second battle of the Trident had seemed every bit as bloody as the first. The river was once again filled with corpses, from the hulking carcasses of elephants to the broken bodies of men. The banks and lands around them were no better, blankets of pure white snow reduced to slops, mud and blood. Arrows peppered the ground, stuck in bodies or shields or the dirt, their colorful fletching a stark contrast to the dull brown of mud and white of still falling snow. To the Lord of the Brindlewood's mind, the two battles fought nearly 2 decades apart had many parallels. A suicide charge had been made from the south bank towards the north, the attackers decimated after they had struck. The bodies were thick enough in the ford to walk between banks without ever touching the water. Once the two sides had engaged, there had been no organization, the battle turning into a bloody brawl. A Targaryen king had died. But history hadn't fully repeated itself, not in every detail. The first battle had seen the rebels flee completely unorganized, only the exhaustion of the royalist keeping it from becoming a rout. The second battle had seen the rebels execute a mostly ordered withdrawal, their survivors covered as they pulled back by withering archer fire that cut down scores of royalists who tried to pursue. There had been no elephants years earlier, whereas now Alaric could see dozens of them scattered dead across the field. It had been summer then, and now it was cold enough to freeze the sweat to your body. No, not everything was the same, but one detail, devastating and heartbreaking, was shared by both battles. Aelor Targaryen wept. Alaric had been by the prince's side through his highest peaks and his lowest valleys. He'd been there when Aelor had won his first victories at Bronze Gate and Drakesgrave, been beside him when they'd ridden at a canter through the streets of King's Landing. He'd been there at the First Trident, the lighting of the Lions and the siege of Casterly Rock, at the devastation of House Rogers and the birth of Dragon of Duskendale's eldest child. And Alaric was here now, as Aelor cradled that child's limp body and sobbed. Renlyr Targaryen had fought valiantly, all would agree. He had slain an officer of the Golden Company and tens of lesser members, had thrown himself into the fray with a vicious abandon reminiscent of his father. But unlike his father, Renlyr didn't possess the knack for survival. He had been separated from King Aegon and the Kingsguard, but such was the way during the chaos of battle. No one knew how he had ended up on the royalist left, just as no one knew how it was that had felled him. One peasant claimed it was Loras Tyrell, though the Knight of Flowers had been fighting in the center and was therefore unlikely to be the culprit. A man-at-arms claimed Renly Baratheon, and a third man Viserys himself. Alaric supposed they'd never know just who it had been, be it a knight of renown or some faceless levy. But it didn't truly matter, dead was dead, and Renlyr's armor was caved in on the right side of his breastplate and his throat was slit. Miecella would be devastated. His beloved daughter fancied herself in love with the boy whose violet eyes now stared upwards. Alaric was pained as well, for despite his concerns over Ren's intent towards Miecella, Alaric almost saw him as a son. He'd seen the boy grow alongside his own children, helped teach him to swing a sword. Barristan, Alaric's youngest son at 5, had asked if he could someday squire for the gregarious Targaryen. Yes, Ren's death would affect him and his daughter terribly, but neither of them, he nor Cella, could imagine the pain in Aelor Targaryen's heart. The white dragon sat in the mud and gore, leaning against the back of a dead horse. His helm with its signature white flames lay discarded on the ground, thrown off when Aelor had found his son under a light covering of the ever-falling snow. He held his child's upper body in his lap, clutching Ren's head to his chest. The Dragon of Duskendale, considered by many to be a ruthless monster, openly cried, his tears falling onto his son's lifeless face. A ring of men stood around him, simultaneously being there for him in his grief, and shielding him from the eyes of the common men of the army. King Aegon Targaryen, the 6th of his name, stood with his helm under his right arm, the 3-headed dragon banner of the true Targaryens billowing behind him. The king had taken an arrow in his left shoulder when he attempted to lead the pursuit of the withdrawing Golden Company. The broken shaft still protruding out formed the armor. Aegon had refused any Maester tend to him before the more severely wounded were cared for. His eyes were grim, peering at the face of his dead cousin and friend. 2 of his Kingsguard stood with him, Sirs Barristan Selmy and Arthur Dane. Roland Storm, he who had removed Viserys' head from his shoulders, had been severely wounded in the fighting that followed, ribs shattered by a hammer-wielding Valentine. Oswell Went was dead, slain by the Knight of Flowers before Tyrell had in turn been slain by the Sword of the Morning in a vicious duel that had lasted half the battle. Balon Swan was leading a party of scouts sent to keep track of the retreating Golden Company. Aging Donald Buckwell had died, slain in one of the hails of arrows. His grandson Aelor, the Lord of Hollard Hall, stood to Alaric's right, tears slipping down his broad face. Bronn's customary smirk was nowhere to be found, the sellsword standing on the other side of the dead stallion from the prince. Beside him were two others members of Aelor's retinue. Men Alaric recognized the face of but couldn't name. Dickon Tarly, holding the banner, was looking anywhere but at the crying prince he had long idolized. His father Lord Randall was organizing the wounded, doing as he had done 2 decades earlier by taking command of the situation while Aelor grieved. The Lord of the Westmark was keeping the looting to a minimum, organizing alongside Jon or in a defensive perimeter on the off chance the Golden Company decided they weren't finished with war for the day. And then there was Balon. Aelor's third son said nothing, face reminiscent of a stone. He was red from his cheeks where blood had splashed through the ventilation holes in his helm all the way down to his armored boots. Alaric had been on the right among the elephants, but even in the short time since the battle had ended, stories were abounding about the young Targaryen. He had been the warrior himself, carving a path into Loras Tyrole's charge far ahead of King Aegon and his Kingsguard. He'd also gone completely unhinged, the always silent Dragon Lord screaming at the top of his lungs as he killed, snarling like a mad dog. Aelor had long ago confided in Alaric his concerns for Balon's sanity, and they had never been more warranted than they were now. Men from his own side eyed him warily as if afraid he would snap all over again. Alaric occasionally glanced at him as well, for Balon's left hand was clenched, right still gripping the hilt of his sheathed sword while the rest of his body was as stock-still as a statue. Lord William Dustin, commander of the Northerners, stepped in close to Aegon's ear from behind. Alaric heard him anyway, even over Aelor's sobs. "What of the Golden Company's wounded, your grace?" Aegon said nothing for a long while, his eyes still locked on another's lifeless ones. Lord Dustin waited, focusing intently on the king's helm, eyes not straying towards the father holding his dead son. When Aegon finally spoke, his voice was rough and grim, and as hard as Valyrian steel. "Traitors and usurpers, find a team of hard-hearted men and kill them all. We take no prisoners today." Balon had come to life at the word kill, whirling and drawing his sword as he started to wade back into the ocean of corpses. All of them watched him go, no one moving to stop him. Barristan, eyes showing his pain for Aelor, shook his head. "He's going to have a few difficulties, your grace. It is going to be very hard for one such as him to come down from the mindset of battle." Alaric started to move, the old wound in his leg aching from both the cold and his exertion during the battle, following Aelor's surviving son. "I will keep an eye on him." Alaric hesitated just a moment by his king's side. "Stay with him, your grace. And if I may make a suggestion," he cast one last glance towards the broken man that had been his mentor, "I advise you write for Alysanne." They brought with them the smell of rot and droves of snow. 200 men and women had remained at Winterfell, a mixture of black brothers, wildlings, southerners, and northerners. Each had taken only enough provisions out of Winterfell's stocks for a sprint south, the rest sent on with those fleeing weeks earlier. Less than 100 horses, shaggy northern garrons, were saddled with those supplies, the message clear. Winterfell was only to be abandoned when all else was lost. And that would only be when most of them were dead. After they'd taken as many down with them as they could. 3 trenches had been dug north of the castle, filled with wood that teams drug in from the Wolfswood, the snow buildup cleaned out of them daily. Barrels of lantern oil stood at the end of each, ready to be poured into the trenches and set alight. The men and spearwives had spent the weeks beforehand crafting arrows, wrapping oil-soaked cloth just above their heads. Braziers lined the walls, their flames continuously stoked, ready for archers to dip the arrows into the flames, lit the cloth, and then fire on whatever descended from the north. There were only 2 craftsmen among them, one a northerner and the other from Harrenhal, so many of the arrows were crudely made, but they would fly well enough. Each man and woman had been equipped with the best steel in Winterfell, many of the wildlings having been ingenuine or of the finely crafted weapons they were given. Longbows and crossbows alike lined the walls, ready to be taken up at a moment's notice. Rangers of the Watch warned that the whites couldn't be stopped by blows that would normally kill a human. They needed to be beheaded or crushed, dismembered and burnt. Everyone present had driven the mantra into their minds. Yes, they were as ready for what was coming as they ever could be. The giants helped too. They had come south 3 days after the refugees had fled, 5 of them in total, led by Mag the Mighty. They were hulking and brutish, only able to stay in Winterfell's courtyard, but they had each remained behind to help hold back the coming waves. Other men and women had straggled in, some remaining to help fight while others followed the others south. Jaime Lannister was among them, leading a band of 20 Black brothers through Winterfell's gates as Catelyn Stark led the refugees out of them. Queensgate had been crushed by the debris, Lannister and his men alive only because they had been scouting to assure no wildlings had climbed over in the immediate vicinity. Robb Stark wasn't among them, a fact that weighed on them all. The wait had seemed endless, but soon enough they arrived. Ghost had woken him, hackles raised and teeth bared. Jaehaerys had untangled himself from Val, the wildling princess, waking in his efforts, dressing herself before assisting the prince who had become her lover into his armor. Jaehaerys normally would have felt shame. He had always been uncomfortable with the dalliances Ren and Aelor Ricker had so often participated in, his only attempt to enter that world having been more embarrassing to the prince than pleasurable. But this was different. As Jaehaerys and Val were both fully aware they were likely to die, and thusly Jaehaerys had no moral qualms. It had been natural to them both to enjoy the other while they could, and others throughout the beleaguered garrison had taken the same notion. Jaehaerys had questioned why Val had stayed. She was a wildling and thusly knew how to fight, and her aim with a bow was excellent, but he had assumed she would follow Dalla and her nephew. The wildling princess had never given him an answer other than a kiss to the lips, and a cryptic someone had too. Whatever her reasons, and despite his concern for her, the two of them had led a band of dying children through snows and starvation, and a bond had risen out of that shared hardship. He was glad she had remained behind for reasons other than the physical ones. She'd been the warm spot in weeks of cold, figuratively and literally, and now it was time for that cold to end, either in death or arrows of fire or both. A runner had been sent to ring the sentry bell. Val having rushed to wake Lord Stark as Jaehaerys walked from the warmth of the chambers to the frigid cold of the snow-filled skies. Ghost continued to growl, staring northward, and after a few minutes Jaehaerys could smell it too, the stench of death and decay. Men and women rushed out of where they had been bivouacking to their assigned duties. Some saddled and geared horses, several teams rode out to pour the oil over the snow in the trenches, and most others rushed to the walls to take up bows. The giants, rising to their impressive heights from where they had slept in the relative warmth of the stables. They were too massive to enter Winterfell proper, made an imposing line of 5 south of the gates, standing shoulder to shoulder as they awaited their turn. The prince didn't know how they intended to escape, as there were no horses they could ride and they had brought no mammoths with them, or if they even intended to escape at all. All he knew was that no living man would ever wish to face down that line, and he wished that these undead ones could feel that same fear. Jaehaerys took a place on the parapets just as the men from the trenches were returning. His sword was at his side, a shield, not his original one, for it had been lost at the wall, tied to his left forearm. Though he had once been a proficient archer, that skill had been lost to him alongside 3 of his fingers and his thumb. Jaehaerys would have to wait, watching the battle unfold from above before joining the defensive lines below. In the meantime he would serve as a runner, resupplying the archers from the stacks of quivers behind him. Val took a position next to him, dressed in her all-white furs, longbow in her hands. She looked beautiful as a different red-headed wildling ever had. Jaehaerys silently prayed he wouldn't end up to be the death of Val as he had been of Ygritte. They came as a horde, fighting through the deep snows, stumbling into and through the trenches. Winterfell became silent save for the wind, its defenders holding their collective breaths. All of the archers had arrows nocked, huddling around braziers, waiting for the orders. It came as the whites reached the second trench, a woman's voice cutting through the howl of the wind. Light. The heads of dozens of arrows burst into flame, their wielders hustling back to line the walls. Draw. Bows creaked as strings were pulled back, archers bending their bodies to angles that pointed their fiery payload to the falling snowflakes. There was a heartbeat of pause as the archers steadied their aim, Jaehaerys unconsciously holding his breath, before the voice spoke a final time. Loose. Dozens of arrows were shot into the dark sky, leaving paths of light in their wake as they traveled up and up before beginning down at an angle. They fell all around the trenches, some embedding themselves into the bodies of the undead, setting them aflame, others hitting the ground, their shafts burning. Most of them, however, hit the trenches, and lines of fire cut through the white of the world as the oil ignited in scores of places, burning towards the other flames until 3 distinct lines of orange and red were visible. Even at this distance, Jaehaerys could see undead burst into flames, some stumbling into the pits of fire, other having been trapped on the spies left in the trenches and unable to climb out before the fires took them. There were no shouts of elation, no cries of victory. The archers simply began firing at will, focusing now on the whites that had escaped the fires. Some were trapped between trenches, others working their way around them, and still more had managed to traverse all 3. Jaehaerys moved to bring quivers of arrows when called for, watching the whites grow closer and closer, more of them skirting around the flaming trenches. The bowmen were soon firing at almost point-blank range, leaning out over the parapets to fire down on the massing horde of undead as they soon pressed heavy against the walls. Boiling oil was dropped on those at the gate, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the stench of decay. But more and more of them took the places of those burnt and boiled. They were in the furs of wildlings and the leathers of the Night's Watch, gripping swords or axes or just swinging their clawed hands. Some didn't even have hands, missing one or more limbs, some dead so long that the flesh had decayed from their bodies, leaving only skeletons and half-helms rushing the walls. It was terrifying beyond anything Jaehaerys had ever seen, so horrible to witness that it felt surreal. Jaehaerys felt like screaming in terror, retching in revulsion, or both. Instead, he ran arrows where they were needed, and when the mass of undead outnumbered the arrows flying in to incinerate them, their numbers shaking the gates of Winterfell soundly, he stretched his shoulders and prepared. The cold wind buffeted his face, his helm lost alongside his shield in the collapse of the wall, but Jaehaerys didn't mind it. He may be half dragon, but he was also half wolf, and wolves were of the cold. The prince sprinted towards the stairs off of the parapets, as down below the giants braced and men and women formed defensive lines. Archers still fired, some shouting warnings that the creatures were trying to climb the walls. The gates rocked violently. Jaehaerys heard wood cracking and creaking, the hinges rocked violently by the press of bodies. So this is how it ends, surrounded by the sound of splintering wood and snarling dead, and the smell of burning flesh. My mother will never forgive me. He made one stop just shy of the stairs, using his good hand to reach out and grab her arm. Val was still firing, her latest quiver close to empty. Jaehaerys yelled over the noise, placing his lips directly next to her ear. Go, Val, you can do no more good. She didn't argue, instead placing one hand against his armored chest. Come with me. Jaehaerys shook his head. You've done your part, now I do mine, go while you can. The princess gripped the back of his neck suddenly, smashing her lips to his in a desperate kiss. Jaehaerys returned it, allowing himself that one moment of sweetness before he disentangled himself. He met her eyes, stark gray and brilliant blue, and gave her a small, sad smile. Go. The Targaryen prince left her there, drawing his sword and taking the steps two at a time to the courtyard. Lord Stark, tall and regal, gripping the two-handed Valyrian steel blade the Starks had carried for hundreds of years, stood at the forefront, his hard face as calm as ever. Mag the Mighty, the leader of the last of the giants, focused his great eyes on the gates, ready to smash whatever crossed through the threshold. Jaehaerys took his place beside Lord Stark and one of the end giants, the one called One Weg One Dar One, and drew his blade. They came over the gates first, climbing the heaped bodies of the others to leap down on the defenders. Giants roared, smashing them aside like annoying flies, men and women cutting them apart. Many carried torches in one hand and a weapon in the other, igniting the whites as soon as they fell to the ground. Jaehaerys swatted aside the blade of a one-armed dead man with half a face, disemboweling him to let black and rotted guts fall to the snow before stabbing him through the remaining eye. The gates finally gave some time later. After enough whites had climbed over the walls to fully engage the lines of remaining defenders and the archers who had remained. When they did, the giants surged forward, crashing into them with shouts and roars, crushing them with mighty clubs and stomps, or picking them up to tear them apart in large hands. But they could only stop so much, and dozens more spilled around them to attack the flesh of man. Jaehaerys lost all true senses. His world had come down to slaying those who should have already been slain, smashing skeletons to scattered bones with his shield and slashing legs and arms and heads, most of them so rotted that they gave way to his blade like water to the bow of a boat. It was hell on earth, battling these creatures that defeated all ideas man had for reality. The courtyard became home to dozens of fires as torchbearers set the fallen whites alight. Yet no matter how many they slew, more took their place. Ghosts snarled and growled, tearing apart white after white. The first child to attack Jaehaerys should have stopped him dead in his tracks, but he was so overwhelmed by the horror of it all that he merely sliced off the small arm carrying the dagger, and cleaved the skull in two. Only a small, insignificant part of his mind recognized the child as one who had frozen to death following Jaehaerys south of the wall. It was as if someone else was doing it. Jaehaerys Targaryen was only an observer, as another being in the skin and armor of Jaehaerys Targaryen fought back the spawn of a cold hell. They fought that way, wading through waves of enemies that never seemed to end for hours or days or seconds. Jaehaerys would stop one only to be attacked by two more, the smell of decaying and burning flesh prevalent over it all. It was a mindless, bitter struggle, one he was both horribly intertwined with and absolutely separated from. The first time he saw one, it was shearing through a giant's leg as if it was made of butter, sending the giant form crashing to the ground, crushing many of its minions beneath it. It was dressed almost like a brother of the Night's Watch, covered in black leathers and armor of studded steel. Its weapon was an odd thing, a long handle twice the length of a man's forearm capped with a twisted, white blade that seemed of ice. Its hair was as white as the falling snow, its skin wrinkled and bluish and looked for all the world like it was made of ice. And its eyes were blue, hauntingly blue, glowing and utterly bright. Jaehaerys was amidst an army of undead trying to kill him, his body instinctually going through the motion of parry, parry, kill, but his eyes watched the being that could only be a White Walker. It cut through defenders like nothing. Jaehaerys watched in terrified amazement as weapon after weapon, be it rusty wildling iron or castle-forged Winterfell steel, shattered when it came in contact with that icy blade. Jaehaerys heard the shouts to retreat, to flee south, but all he could do was watch the being carve through the battlefield. And then its eyes locked on Jaehaerys. The other was upon him before he could truly comprehend that blade slashing in. He drove his sword to meet it out of instinct, crying out when the steel shattered and the pommel was wrenched from his hands. The other angled its odd weapon, what the Targaryen prince swore to be a smile on its icy lips as it drove forward to make the kill, and then shattered into 1,000 slivers of ice. Jaehaerys blinked thrice before he realized he wasn't dead. In front of him, where once there had been an ice demon about to cleave him in half, stood Eddard Stark, face equally surprised. Ice, its Valyrian steel blade smoking, was thrust out from his body, occupying the space the other's torso had been. The Lord of Winterfell and the Prince of the Iron Throne locked gazes, and both of their eyes lit with understanding. Eddard spoke, voice rough. "Go, rally those south, tell them off this." The Lord of the North whirled and sliced a charging White in half, actions one smooth motion before he offered his nephew one last parting phrase. "Tell them winter has come." The Lord Paramount of the North waded back into the fray. There were other White Walkers, eyes icy blue and hair white as snow, striding through the gates of Winterfell as if they were conquering kings. Jaehaerys watched his uncle make for one greatsword flashing for only a moment. Then he turned and ran, Ghost appearing at his side, the white direwolf red and black with old and new blood. The waiting horses were gone by the time he arrived there, the picket lines clean save for one being on top of Garen, firing arrows from horseback. Val saw him, her horse near prancing, and kicked the Garen to his side, tossing the bow aside as Jaehaerys let his shield fall to the ground. Jaehaerys climbed behind her, wrapping his bloody arms around her middle as she kicked the shaggy horse into a sprint through Winterfell's southern gates, Ghost loping along beside them. The two said nothing as they left the crackling of fire and roar of battle behind them, said nothing as they rode deeper into the snowy night. There were no words to be said that could summarize any of what had just occurred, nothing horrible and terrifying enough to give it the levity it needed. Only one thing echoed in Jaehaerys' addled mind, spoke in his uncle's haunting baritone. Winter had come. It took 5 weeks and twice as many battles before the Golden Company surrendered. After the second battle of the Trident, the Golden Company had retreated towards King's Landing, though it had fallen to the Dornish one day before. King Aegon hadn't followed them. Instead, he had marched for the docks south of Derry, sending instructions to Lord Edmure Tully to chase the Golden Company towards the Dornish via Harrenhal. The king's instincts had been right. He found the Golden Company a day's ride away from those docks, marching towards the sea to flee back to Essos. The royalist cut off that avenue of retreat in the Battle of the Flats, and pursued them until he engaged them again 2 days south at the Battle of Barry Keep. Each battle saw a royalist triumph, but also saw a smoothly executed Golden Company retreat, leaving Aegon on the cusp of complete victory but denying it to him time and time again. Lord Tully's forces engaged them days later, Aegon arriving only as the Golden Company abandoned the field. The two forces merged and pursued, chasing the Golden Company towards the Dornish, who were marching out of King's Landing after installing Lord Anders Ironwood as regent of the city. It was a game of cat and mouse for days, accompanied by dozens of light skirmishes, and a handful of full-scale engagements with the same result as all the others, before the trap was laid. Aegon and his force made a point of pursuing the Golden Company, while continuously denying them any travel north towards the coast of the Bay of Crabs, while the Dornish denied them access to the narrow sea. The king himself had devised the simple yet effective plan. They would funnel the Golden Company to Maidenpool, the only port deep enough between the docks of Derry and the Whispers on the Claw to not be frozen by the damnable cold. There they would unite with the Dornish to finish them. For once it went perfectly. The Golden Company was caught just as her ships began to dock, thousands of royalists charging into the old town of Maidenpool from the east, west, and south. The Battle of the Bloody Shallows earned the name. The waters of the port at Maidenpool turned red with blood. It was fierce but short, claiming the lives of thousands in less than an hour of brutal combat. The Golden Company, an organization that had survived for generations, was cut to pieces on the shores of the Bay of Crabs. Half of her galleys burned before the others fled without a single ground soldier aboard. The prisoners were sent under heavy guard to King's Landing to await judgment by King Aegon. Renly Baratheon was among them, wounded and captured by Balon Targaryen as he tried to board a galley. Renly's brother Stannis had defeated the last of the Ironborn off the shores of Pike, and was sailing to the warmer shores south where he could make better landfall to unload the plethora of prisoners he had taken. Whatever remained of the Ironborn fleets were scattering back to their rocky islands. And though Aegon knew he would have to scourge them clean in the coming months, their teeth had been removed from being able to inflict further damage. The War of the Three Kings was over. The Second War for the Dawn had just begun. Aegon stretched his left shoulder, feeling the healing scar from the arrow he had taken resist the movement. He had fought in every battle despite the warnings of both the Maesters and his Kingsguard, compensating for the wounded shoulder as well as he could. The wound had been more painful than debilitating, but he had yet to regain the full range of motion he was used to. He also had a bad habit of reopening the puncture wound while fighting. Every undershirt the king owned now bore bloodstains around the injury. It was proving as frustrating as it was uncomfortable. Sirs Barristan and Arthur Dayne sat horses alongside him, watching as crews scavenged the battleground for salvageable weapons and armor, pulling corpses from the shallow waters and lining them along the docks and beaches. Maesters and healers roved the lines of wounded royalists, saving who they could, forsaking those they couldn't. Balon led the hard-hearted butchers, most of them men from his father's retinue, slitting the throats of the wounded traitors, sparing only the odd few of noble blood to be hostages. Peasant levies swarmed the bodies of dead Golden Company men, brawling with one another over the golden rings of service that lined many arms. It was the aftermath of war. Aegon had grown used to it, just as he had grown used to death. Lord William Dustin had died at the Battle of the Flats. Jon Arryn, the Lord Paramount of the Vale, had been slain at the Battle of Barry Keep. His son, now Lord Ardes Arryn Roman II of the Vale, had bravely taken command of his father's forces for the remainder of the War of the Three Kings, but the young man was grieving fiercely. Over a dozen minor lords had been killed, and several more wounded. Randyll Tarly had lost an eye. Ren had lost his life. My uncle was right all these years. War is hell. Aegon was shook from his reverie by the sound of approaching hooves. His other uncle, the Red Viper of Dorne, approached atop a Dornish sandsteed, his lips twisted into a smirk of a smile. Aegon returned it. He hadn't seen Oberyn Martell as much in recent years as he had when he was a child, but his mother's brother had always cared greatly for him. This was their first meeting since months before Aegon had originally traveled north, their two forces in constant contact but never having merged until today. Uncle, cousins. The king called as Oberyn reined to a stop in front of him, nodding in greeting to both Barristan and the Sword of the Morning. A spear was strapped to his back, and two of his bastard daughters, brutal Obara and austere Nymeria, sat sandsteeds behind him. The Red Viper let the smirk grow into a full smile. Nephew, I hear you've never lost a battle. You're making quite a name for yourself as a warrior. That praise once would have inflated Aegon's ego for days, but now he only nodded lightly. None of it would have been as complete without your help. You and Uncle Doran have my thanks. How is Aaliyah? She and the other hostages were unharmed when we took King's Landing. She wished to be here, but her mother refused to let her out of her sight again. They were both waiting with my supply train well out of harm's way. I imagine they'll catch up to us any moment now that it is over. The Dornishman's smile faded. How is Aelor? Aegon looked away, back to the scurrying figures around the dock, debating just what to say. He eventually decided to tell only what Aelor himself would, the truth. He comes to the council. He fights in the battles as well as he always did, kills as only he can. He oversees picket lines and scouting duties, organizes the layout of the camp each night. On the surface, he is the same authoritative, ruthless prince. Aegon sighed. How is he truly, though? I don't know, I'm only his son. Oberyn nodded slowly, looking down. He always loved his family more than life itself. Now he's lost 2 children and had to kill a brother, even if it was one of your Kingsguard, to swing the sword. The King of the Iron Throne sighed. He hardly speaks outside of duty. He never contradicts my decisions or orders anymore, even if they are questionable. If you would have told me a year ago that I would miss having my uncle advising my every move, I would have called you a liar. Now I'm desperately wishing for him to call me foolish and correct what I'm doing again. Aegon glanced back to Prince Oberyn, the Red Viper's concerns for one of his oldest friends clear on his olive-toned face. I wrote for Alysanne. She should already be at Chiltern, awaiting our return as we move back north. Hopefully she can bring him back from wherever it is he's at now. Anyone who truly knows him can tell it isn't here. He glanced back to Balin, his cousin, in the process of bringing his sword down on a wounded mercenary. Hopefully she can bring them both back. Sir Barristan spoke up, his eyes also on Balin, though he spoke of the lad's parents. She has always been able to reach him, even when he was long past listening to anyone else. I've seen him deal with grief and rage before, but never this way. Perhaps Alysanne has. The Prince of Dorne nodded. We can hope. His face lightened as he changed the subject, though it wasn't necessarily to a lighter topic. What is this about marching north that your ravens have been mentioning? You're a bit too old to believe in ghost stories. I wish they were only ghost stories, uncle, but I've got the entire north coming towards me to feed and protect. Jaehaerys is, or was, at Winterfell to try and hold back what's chasing them. I pray to the Seven every night that he meets us at the neck. I don't think Aelor would survive the loss of another son. One can only pray. His smirk returned. I imagined you wouldn't call Dornishmen into these snows without a true threat. While I was in King's Landing, I recruited a few thousand bits of help. If Alysanne can't cheer Aelor up, perhaps another old friend will. Aegon cocked an eyebrow, following the Red Viper's extended finger. Squinting against the white of the snow, Aegon could just make out a line of wagons rumbling through the snow. They didn't carry men or rations. Instead, they were filled with sand. And nestled in that sand were dozens of jars. Her sons looked haggard and worn, their silvery hair unkempt and faces gaunt, the dark circles under their eyes easily visible against their pale Valyrian skin. There were also two of them missing. Neither of their eyes, Targaryen violet or Lefford dark brown, met hers as Ser Vardis helped her off of the mare she'd ridden from the Gates of the Moon to Chiltern, and then from Chiltern to where the army was camped. King Aegon Targaryen, the most powerful man in Westeros, looked like a chastened child, eyes locked on his armored boots. Her third son Balin, he who had gained a sort of vicious infamy in the War of the Three Kings, was fixated on his gauntlet, scratching at an invisible blemish. Even the Kingsguard, deadly men who had faced down lines of screaming knights, looked anywhere but at her. Wars they could handle. Grieving mothers they could not. Aegon cleared his throat and finally raised his gaze to her as she crunched over the snows towards him, her woolen skirts brushing the mud and ice. Despite the pain in her heart, a pain she had thought couldn't get worse after Rhaella until news of Renly reached her, a streak of relief filled her soul when she looked to the boy she had mothered since he was less than 2 name days old. He was changed, to be sure. Considerably thinner than he had been last, she saw him and his face now one of a hardened man and not an untested boy, but she could still see her Aegon underneath it. He squared his shoulders as he spoke, voice strong and formal. Lady Alysanne, I. The king fell suddenly silent when she threw her arms around his armored middle. She felt Aegon let out a long, relieved sigh, and then he was hugging her back, his voice now small and quiet. I missed you, mother. Alysanne hugged him a long moment before she leaned back, fighting back tears as she placed a motherly hand on his cheek. She didn't trust her voice, so she didn't use it, instead turning to wrap Balin in a similar hug. He had grown an inconceivable amount since she'd last saw him in the courtyard of the Red Keep. Balin was tall, nearly as tall as Aelor, and where once there had been peach fuzz there was now whiskers. They're both men now. Gods, how much I've missed. She didn't say anything for a long while, holding the 2 Targaryen warriors, thanking the old gods and the knew that they were alive and well. She felt the sudden urge to hold Aemon, her sweet, sweet Aemon, though she knew he was traveling south with the refugees of the north. A pang of fear for Jaehaerys spiked through her, as did a fresh new wave of pain as she thought of Renly. He never got to meet Lucerys, he never even knew. It took her a long while before she gathered the strength to speak without her voice cracking. Where is Aelor? Aegon shook his head. I didn't tell him you were coming. He is not himself. I don't believe he has slept since. Alysanne had heard all she needed to. Take me to him. Her husband's tent was dark when she quietly stepped through the canvas, her eyes taking several moments to adjust to the dim interior. This tent was different than the one she and Aelor had hammered out their own agreements in outside Lannisport. Then his had been the center of command for the entire surrounding army, needing to be capable of housing all of his advisors and chief lords. During this campaign, however, those duties fell to Aegon, and so the hand of the king had opted for a modest pavilion capable of housing a cot, a chest, a small writing table, 1 brazier for warmth, and not much else. A candle sat on his chest of belongings next to the cot, which clearly hadn't been used any time recently. It, like the lantern on the table and brazier in the corner, was unlit. Quill and parchment was perfectly organized alongside said lantern, too perfect to have been used since they were originally set out. While the canvas walls protected her from the bite of the wind and the falling snow, the interior was nearly as cold as the conditions outside of it. It was tidy, much too tidy for her Aelor. It looked as if a ghost resided here, a ghost that was currently seated in an open-backed stool in the very center of the shelter. Alysanne didn't say a word as she moved towards the broad shoulders and lean hips that she knew every bit as well as she knew her own body. Aelor's back was to her dragon lord as still and silent as the mountains around the golden tooth of her youth. He remained that way as she neared, his head down as he focused on something in his hands that was shielded from her view. The dragon of Duskendale didn't even flinch when she slipped her hands under his arms and wrapped her own around his ribs, resting her chin on his left shoulder. It wasn't difficult. Even seated, her husband was much larger than she herself was, despite Alysanne being on the taller side for a woman. Tucking her cheek against his neck, she peered down towards his lap where Aelor held the object of his fixation. The empty eyeholes of her son's helm stared back at her. The warlike spikes along the center a sharp contrast to the pale skin holding them, the dark steel polished to a shine. The lack of violet eyes staring back at her from the empty black eye gaps broke her heart into more pieces, as did the lack of a smiling wren underneath it all. I'll never see it again. Tears burned her eyes until one slipped down her cheek, trailing off to run across the smooth steel of her husband's shoulder plate. He never moved his head, focused on the helm of their son, but one broad hand reached up to cup her cheek. His voice was rough and raspy when he spoke, the palm of his hand cold against her cheek. "Allie," the lady of Duskendale said nothing, instead turning her head to press a kiss to his cheek before looking back down at the piece of armor in his hands. With a long, infinitely tired sigh, the Targaryen prince melted back into her, his movement accompanied by the sound of popping joints. Neither of them said anything for a while, peering down at the memento of their son. Alysanne leaned her head against his, letting tears roll unchecked. Aelor kept his hand on her cheek, thumb gently stroking, speaking after a long while with a somber, broken tone. "I lied to you, Allie. I said I'd bring our sons home and I failed." Her own voice wavered as she spoke, but Alysanne was past caring enough to try and hide weakness, particularly from Aelor. "Our boy never did follow our plans for him. I couldn't even avenge him, not properly. Viserys was dead by the time I learned Ren was gone. In my youth I would have slaughtered the entire Golden Company in vengeance, as I tried to do to the Lannisters after Aaliyah, but now even death doesn't fill the hole in my soul. Ren wouldn't have wanted you to anyway, love. He was always more diplomat than warrior, a smile rather than a punch, a love letter rather than a declaration of war. Her voice broke and the sobs came uncontrolled. He gently reached across to the table beside him and placed Renler's helm there before leaning out of her grasp. He slid around on the stool, and she was greeted by the dark bags under his eyes and his unkempt beard before he reached for her again, pulling her into his embrace. She clutched him with ferocity, burying her head into the side of his neck as he spoke again over her tears. "How could you ever forgive me?" It took her long minutes to control herself enough to answer, the sobs slowing as she struggled to regain herself. When she did, her voice was muffled by his skin, but she put as much conviction behind it as she could. "I never once blamed you. Ren fought and he died just as Rhaegar and Renfred Ricker and all those before him have. You told me yourself when you started his training that it was the way of war." Aelor grunted, arms tightening around her. "You never truly believe it will happen to your own children when you say those things. You always foresee it as happening to someone else. Someone distant and foreign, not someone you held since the day he was brought into this world." Alysanne choked back another round of sobs, rallying her inner strength before she leaned back in his arms. She placed a hand on either side of his face, meeting his eyes as she spoke with as much conviction as her broken heart held. "There are 7 others you have held since the day they entered this world left, and they need you now more than ever. Aegon is still half a boy. He needs your guidance and your strength. Balon has lost his eldest brother and half of his mind. He needs your strength. Aemon is coming south with thousands of refugees. They need your strength. Jaehaerys is fleeing from a foe he cannot defeat and likely feels as if it is all his fault. He needs your strength. And I am Renler and Rhaella's mother just as much as you are their father. I need your strength. We can grieve, love, and we will for the rest of our lives, but we have a duty. Not only to our living children but to the one we won't see in this life again. There is much to live for as a man, not as a hermit in his cave." Like Lucaries, she wondered if she should mention that they had a grandson but opted to wait. Now was a time to grieve with one another. There would be time to tell him all else later. There would be time to tell him of grandsons and good daughters and even dragons. They'd kept the hatchlings quite from all, no one having entered or left the gates of the moon aside from the Kingsguard and herself. And Sirs Arthur and Roland, and Tyrion Lannister, who had been there at the first, had been sworn to secrecy. At first it was because they were too small to have done anyone any good. Alysanne and Daenerys had wondered if they might in truth die. Creatures of fire born into a world of ice. Aegon and Aelor hadn't needed any further distractions from the difficult battle they faced, particularly not one as significant to their house as Balerion, Aelin and Rhaegal were, at least not while the hatchlings were too small to singe a housecat, much less an army. Their war was to be won with swords and strategy, not dragonfire. The women had agreed at best to not give the men even the slightest idea of anything different. Then they had kept the news hidden for fear that it would draw Viserys down on the gates of the moon. Nearly all of the fighting men in the Vale had marched to war, as they were too far from the western coast to draw the ire of Ironborn raiders, and even that heady defense could have fallen to the discipline of the Golden Company. If Viserys had taken dragons into his possession, and in the process Daenerys, his rebellion would have grown tenfold. Now, though, there was no true reason to hide the birth of the dragons from Aegon and Aelor. They were nearly a year old and bigger than any animal Alysanne had seen, though she wasn't sure how anyone could ride the beasts. Word of the return of dragons was not to be entrusted to a raven, but since she, someone who had seen them grow, was here in the flesh, well, perhaps it was time. The dragons were willful and ornery, flying where they wanted when they wanted and preying on livestock and wildlife alike. They could not truly be controlled, though they always returned to wherever Dany was at night, save for Balerion. The small folk of the Vale were doubtlessly spreading word that they had seen dragons swooping through the snowy skies. Only the snows that prevented easy travel and the skepticism the stories were clearly met with keeping the news from already spreading all over Westeros. The secret wouldn't be held much longer. If anyone had a right to know, it was the man she was with now. But she didn't say anything, at least not then. There was something else wholly inappropriate for a woman grieving on her mind. They'd kept word of the dragons hidden for almost a year. A few more hours would make no difference. Aelor had watched her as she spoke, his hand at some point having stroked back the hair from her face. Alysanne kept her eyes on his, shaking from the cold and the emotion and something else entirely. Aelor finally smiled, a small and sad smile deadened by clear and obvious pain, but a smile nonetheless. "I never deserved you." Her response was to press her lips to his, pushing as close to his body as she physically could. One turned to another, then another. The next morning the cot was anything but tidy. Aegon, a hard grip, grabbed his shoulder, shaking the King of the Iron Throne out of his dreams of sunshine and fire. "Wake up, son, now." Aegon VI opened his eyes to see his uncle standing over him, silhouetted against the light of a lantern. The dragon of Duskendale turned to light the candles on Aegon's table as the king sat up on the cot, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Uncle, what hour is it?" "Closer to dusk than dawn." He was forced to squint as the candles burned to life, and when Aelor turned to face him again, Aegon was taken aback by the difference in the man. This was not the haggard, broken-hearted man he had seen this morning. The darkness under his eyes had dissipated some, and Aelor stood taller and straighter than Aegon had seen him in years. There was a healthier gleam to his Valyrian features as well, the blush of life prevalent where there had been only deadened white skin earlier. His uncle looked positively alive. With a shock, Aegon realized his uncle wasn't in his armor for the first time in forever. Instead, dressed in a simple robe cinched at the waist that was entirely unfit for the deep snows outside. When Aegon's sleep-addled mind remembered Alysanne had arrived only hours earlier, it all clicked. Oh, the wave of revulsion he felt, those were his parents, for the sake of the seven, was quashed by his uncle's intently focused gaze and tone of voice. "Are you awake enough now, boy?" Aegon didn't even mind being called boy, as long as it was the old Aelor saying it instead of the new. He nodded once and Aelor reached out to grip his shoulder. It was strong as the conviction in the dragon of Duskendale's voice. "Good, you're going to need all of your wits for what I'm about to tell you." Jaehaerys looked half frozen and haggard when he rode through the trenches behind a stunningly beautiful woman. His scratched armor was caked in blood and ice, whiskers unkempt and black hair unhealthy, his body thin with half of one hand missing. Aelor had never seen a better sight. The black-haired prince huddled beneath a pair of heavy furs in his brother's tent, a steaming bowl of the bland-tasting stew the defenders of the neck had grown accustomed to on the table before him. The blonde-haired woman called Val was seated beside him, likewise equipped. Aelor had noticed that the wildling had refused to release his nephew's right arm. That was problematic considering Lyanna Stark had a death grip on the other. The poor lad hadn't been able to touch his stew. Although I doubt he could eat, not with so many eyes boring into him. The long table was filled with people, each one staring at the Black Prince. Aelor sat at its head, Lyanna and then the two recent arrivals on his right. Aelor shook his head ever so slightly. "This is the first time since Harrenhal I have ever been around Lyanna Stark without the wish to snap her neck." He was so happy to see Jaehaerys he couldn't summon anger at the she-wolf even if he tried. Alysanne sat to his left, one hand resting on his own arm while the other gripped Aemon, their eldest surviving child. She hadn't let him out of her sight since he had staggered out of the swamps of the Neck a fortnight earlier, somewhere along the journey having taken a semblance of command of the great host leaving their homeland. Perhaps it was his Targaryen name or the fact that the evacuation was his idea, or maybe because they found him the best man for the job. Whatever the reason, Aemon had gained a large measure of respect from the northern lords and ladies. Lord Mace Tyrell, having arrived a week earlier with his army after ridding the coasts of Ironborn holdings, was beside Aemon, his second son Garland next to him. Both Tyrells had been floored and devastated by Laura's betrayal and death, and both were intent on proving their loyalty. Brandon Stark, potentially. Now the Lord of Winterfell continued on that side, Lady Stark next to him. Lord Edmure Tully was seated next to the end and his sister, across from Tyrion Lannister, who was followed on that side back towards Aelor by Oberyn Martell and Ardes Arryn. Tormund Giantsbane, a brute of a wildling, was seated between the young Lord of the Vale and Val, eyeing her curiously. And across from Aelor at the opposite end of the table, light dancing in his green eyes and a smirk on his lips, sat Jaime Lannister. Both Jaime and Lyanna in the same room, and my fists aren't even clenched. I'd like to think I've learned diplomacy and restraint, but I imagine I'm just getting old. The Ranger of the Night's Watch had arrived only hours before Jaehaerys and his wildling princess, having fought at the Battle of Winterfell until it became pointless to linger there. The surviving Black brothers, many of them lost as to what their lives were now without a wall or Lord Commander, had instantly rallied to him, and Jaime had become part of the council as a representative to the men of the Night's Watch. No one knew what would happen to them once the war was done. There was no wall to return to. For now, all parties involved were focused on the coming threat rather than any decisions regarding the future. There would be no future if they lost the coming fight. Still, the change in the political landscape of Westeros left many a question they would hopefully be forced to confront someday. For now, old enemies and sworn rivals coexisted as best they could. Others stood in the tent around them. Alaric Randall Tarly, Sir Carol Vance and Wyleys Manderly, Bronn and Sirs Barristan and Arthur Dane. And perhaps most interestingly of all, young Elinor Prester, the Shebel of Feast Fires. Short, slender, and with hair as light and delicate as corn silk, she had not only repulsed the Ironborn from her childhood home, but also liberated several other Westerland holdings ahead of Mace Tyrell's advancing force, rallying the relieved defenders until she controlled half an army. She was as sharp of tongue and vicious as she was attractive. Aelor liked her. There was no King Aegon, but that was intended. While the Dragon of Duskendale knew Aegon would love to be here greeting his brother, the king was on a much more vital mission. Lady Stark spoke, voice calm but carrying a hint of the grief Aelor knew she must be experiencing. She too had lost a son, and her husband Lord Eddard had not made it south. Lyanna, Lady Val, Jaehaerys will not be able to eat if his arms are occupied. Lyanna didn't budge, which was all well and good. Jaehaerys could hardly maneuver the spoon with only a pinky. The Lady Val, however, did release his right arm, though one hand remained out of Aelor's sight, likely on Jaehaerys' thigh. Aelor raised an eyebrow when Jaehaerys didn't even so much as blush. The boy he had known would have been a red-faced, spluttering fool at such an obvious sign of affection from a woman. But then again, Jaehaerys was no longer the boy Aelor had known. His time and trials in the north had turned him very much so into a man. It was obvious when you looked into his eyes that Jaehaerys had seen things that had shaken his very soul. Nothing as trivial as a woman he was clearly involved with showing affection in public would rattle him these days, especially if that woman had underwent harsh trials alongside him. Aelor had never fought alongside a woman before, but he still thoroughly understood the bonds formed between those who share suffering. He spoke, covering any awkwardness others might feel at the sight. "Prince Jaehaerys, what are we facing?" Jaehaerys took a mouthful of the stew, eyes on the table as he considered his response. "I'm sure Sir Jaime has already told you," the Lannister in question answered. "Oh, I have, but they'll actually believe it if it comes from you." A few shifted uncomfortably at the statement. Aelor did not. The prince mulled his answer a few moments longer before he spoke again, voice quiet and deadly serious. "Do you remember all of the stories you heard as a child? Tales of ice demons turning the world into a place of everlasting snow, slaughtering all they come across. Stories of pain and terror and death." Prince Jaehaerys looked up, meeting his uncle's eyes and holding them. "They're all true except that the reality is much, much worse." Jaime Lannister chimed in again, picking back up his narrative now that he knew they'd actually listen. "Corpses without guts and half their faces gone, men and women with their arms missing and organs hanging out, sometimes straight skeletons, all walking at you as if they were no different than a normal Westerosi. Except of course that they are carrying swords or axes and they're trying to kill you. Catelyn Stark began to rise, hand on her young son's shoulder. Perhaps we should leave. Brandon Stark's voice was calm and lordly. Quite an impressive feat for one not yet even 2 and 10. No. These are my people and my lands being discussed. I will not shy from the facts. Bran swallowed once before adding quietly, "Father wouldn't." His mother retook her seat, visibly fighting her emotions. Harry spoke as if there had been no interruption. The walking dead aren't what we should be scared of other than their overwhelming numbers. They can be killed with sword and shield and fire. It's their masters that are the key to it all, they cannot. There was a moment of silence before Edmure Tully's disbelieving voice filled it. "They can't be killed, nonsense." Truth Trout chimed in Sir Jaime. "Two of my best men tried to engage one, both of their swords shattered on its and then it cleaved them in two. Man-made steel cannot bring them down." Arthur Dayne raised an eyebrow. "Then what can?" The Black Lion shook his blonde head, leaning back in his chair. "I have no idea." Harry's was still methodically devouring spoonful after spoonful of stew, Val eating just as feverishly beside him. His voice was quiet and calm when he spoke in between. "I do." He looked up again, eyes focusing on Bran Stark. "Valyrian steel shatters the demons into a million pieces. Uncle Eddard and Ice saved me from one before he ordered me to flee." Harry swallowed, looking down once more as he went back to his stew. "Then he charged others. And I lost sight of him. Valyrian steel will destroy them, it is all we have." "Well, we certainly have plenty of that," dryly quipped Tyrion Lannister while eyeing Lord Tarly, Heartsbane slung across his back. "Lord Tarly Lyn Corbray, the axe of Lord Celtiger, the king's newfound weapon. Why, I dare say the walkers are doomed." Tyrion's mismatched eyes turned to Aelor, then eyebrow quirked. "Speaking of King Aegon, as I've told you all, the king is working on another solution. Unless he has it already, it won't matter." Harry's had finished his stew, rising and using his good hand to wrap the blanket that had been thrown over his own shoulders around Val. "Lady Stark, Lady Alysanne and the other non-combatants should travel as far from here as they can as quickly as they can. The enemy will be upon us soon." Lyanna was looking up at her son, still gripping his maimed left hand. "You have only just arrived. Ned and the others slowed them down as much as we could. But just as we made better time south from Winterfell than the non-combatants did, the dead will make the best time of all." Harry's let his eyes sweep the room. "Our enemy does not rest, they do not sleep. Storms don't slow them, for they are the ones to bring the storms. They are hard to kill, perhaps even impossible, and they will not stop until all of us are just like them." The wall fell before them. "We had best pray to the old gods and the new that we do not, or south will not go south enough. Get the non-combatants away from this place and prepare every fighter we can field." Harry's turned to stride from the tent. "It is as Uncle Eddard always promised. Winter has come and night will soon be upon us." He had visited the Eyrie once before in the 10th year of his reign. Jon Arryn had hosted Aegon and half of the king's court for a fortnight, taking the young Targaryen falconing in the mountains and hosting a tourney near the Blood Gate. The views from the impregnable castle atop the giant's lance had been astounding, enrapturing the blood of the dragon. The young king had spent an absurd amount of his time on the balcony of his chambers, pretending he was riding a dragon over the forests and valleys below. And now, all these years later, Aegon was returning to the Eyrie, hoping to realize that childhood dream and make it reality. He wouldn't have thought it possible a month earlier. But he had seen the truth of it all 2 nights before. He had never known of Alysanne, Arthur Dayne, or Roland Storm to be liars, but it had all seemed an impossible thing to him when Aelor first told him of what Alysanne had said. The Kingsguard Knights had supported the Lady of Duskendale's claim, but it still had taken the insistence of his uncle to convince the king to ride out and see for himself. He was certainly glad he had. One was cream and gold, the other green and bronze. And they were both the most breathtaking things he had ever seen. Daenerys, her hair still growing from the fire that had taken Rhaella's life and hatched the wonders before them, had taken command of the servants of the Gates of the Moon. A shelter was erected each night over the huddled forms of her hulking dragons, both of them having grown much too large to fit even in the stables. Aelin and Rhaegal were not obedient by any stretch of the imagination, but they seemed content enough to allow hunters sent out to bring them the majority of their meals, though they had made prey of a few unfortunate horses and still hunted occasionally. Scorched bones were scattered all over the Gates of the Moon, much to Lysa Arryn's furious consternation. Only the continued efforts of her daughter Aemma had kept the Tully woman from trying to expel the Targaryens. How she intended to do it when Daenerys had dragons was beyond Aegon, but he had understood even in his first visit all those years ago that Lysa wasn't quite right. Both dragons were big, much larger than anything a year in age had any right to be, and both were large enough now that they could quite likely bear a smaller human such as Daenerys, though his aunt hadn't tried. But Aegon was no small human even after losing a considerable amount of weight over the past year. And while he, just like everyone else, didn't truly know the capabilities of a dragon, he was fairly certain they would have difficulties bearing him any true distance. But Balerion Aegon had yet to see the black dragon with any real clarity. But the glimpses he had caught of a massive shadow cutting through the snowy skies overhead left the King of the Iron Throne with the impression that he was largest of them all. Aegon prayed he would prove large enough, for if he didn't, then his folly would be for naught. That of course required him to survive, and Aegon wasn't certain he was going to. I've endured over a dozen battles, but it's going to be buggering ice that kills me. The same factors that made the Eyrie unassailable also made it very difficult to resupply. The walking path up and down the Giant's Lance was not very large and certainly wasn't easy to traverse, and this logistical issue and the severe cold forced the Arryns to retire to the Gates of the Moon during the winters. While the path from the base of the Giant's Lance to the first Waycastle Stone wasn't overly difficult, and the steeper path from Stone to the second Waycastle Snow was manageable as well, the path from Snow to the third Waycastle Sky was treacherous, open to the biting wind. Its steps were cracked and rotting, deteriorating from the repeating process of freezing, thawing, and refreezing. Handholds carved into the mountain itself led from Sky to the walls of the Eyrie. Though a pulley system was used to transport supplies and oftentimes people this last leg of the journey, that pulley system was of course useless when there was no one in the fortress above, so it did Aegon no good for now. It was a difficult, dangerous journey in the best of conditions. Aegon was almost as far from the best of conditions as one could get, but he needed Balerion, and Balerion had made his den in the unoccupied Eyrie. The king had ordered his Kingsguard to remain with the army now under Aelor's command, while Aegon himself rode as hard as the weather would allow for the Eyrie. None of his surviving white cloaks, there were only 4 of them now, the last year having cut his Kingsguard nearly in 2, had argued indignantly, but if Aegon's plans worked as he intended, the deadly fighters would be trapped in the Vale, while the king flew back to his army. He had relented by accepting the wounded Sir Roland into the retinue of 15 men accompanying the king, although the ride must have jostled the bastard-born man's shattered ribs and left him in a constant state of pain. The Stormlander had endured the entire journey in silence, however, and had remained at the Gates of the Moon as Aegon and one other figure began the ascent. Who would have believed a son of Rhaegar Targaryen and a daughter of Robert Baratheon would one day work together? Mya Stone was tall and strapping lass who kept her coal-black hair shorn short. It was an unkept secret that she was the bastard of Robert Baratheon, conceived when the would-be usurper had been fostered in the Vale. Though Mya had given no indication that she was aware of just who her father was, she had been taken in and raised by Nestor Royce, the Sir of the Gates of the Moon, left alone by Aelor despite her parentage. Calmer the Grey had once told Aegon that that had been an insistence of Alysanne, not a mercy from the dragon of Duskendale himself. Mya had by one way or another become the chief guide on journeys to the Eyrie, the blue-eyed woman and her team of mules ferrying trains of supplies up and down the Giant's Lance during the summer years. She had willingly volunteered to show the king the way to the Eyrie. Aegon assumed she probably regretted it now. Under normal conditions, the path from the Gates of the Moon to the Eyrie would take half a day, but the snow and ice had made it instead nearly 2 whole days. Aegon and Mya had camped in the stone walls of snow during the night, using the warmth of a small fire, the mules and each other. The bastard and the king's dalliance had been one of straight need. Aegon hadn't had a woman in over a year, and Mya had been more than willing. I can't begin to imagine what Aelor would say if he knew I was sleeping with the daughter of the man who killed my father. The girl seemed plenty wise enough to know that it meant nothing beyond a physical release, and Aegon had done his best to assure no bastard of his own would result from the meeting. He intended to be the second coming of Aegon the Conqueror, not Aegon the Unworthy. Despite that spot of warmth, it had been a cold, harrowing trip, and this was the worst of it. An advantage to the steep angle of the mountain from Sky to the Eyrie was that there was finally only small amounts of snow buildup. The cold stone mostly clear of the frozen rain that Aegon had seen more of than he ever wanted to see again. But while snow couldn't accumulate on the handholds, ice could still freeze it, making the already hard climb all the harder. Aegon had already slipped twice, only catching himself with his frozen fingertips at the last second. The wind bit through the many layers of furs and cloth, its howl barely registering over the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. Aegon's progress was slow, one hand grip and footstep at a time, made more difficult from the not-quite-healed wound to his shoulder. Aegon had never been overly pious, but for every foot he ascended, half a dozen prayers of thanks went up with it. The Eyrie loomed high overhead, both close and forever far away. The king of the Iron Throne, the wealthiest man in Westeros, scraped his hands and knees through the fabric of his garments as he clung to the side of a mountain, climbing towards a dragon that might very well kill him if the ascent didn't. His arms were burning as if they were engulfed in dragon fire by the time he reached the top of the handholds, a short and blissfully horizontal path between him and the gates of the Eyrie's courtyard. Aegon pulled his body over the precipice and instantly collapsed to the ground, rolling over onto his back as his booted feet still hung over the steep incline he had just climbed. He lay there, chest heaving as he puffed mists of steam into the frigid air, snow pelting his face. Mya had stayed in the rough walls of Sky with the mules, instructed to wait 2 days before she began her descent. Aegon would join her if he had failed, ride off the giant's lance astride a black and crimson dragon if he was successful, or be dead. Somewhere in that time frame he would achieve one of the three. In truth, he hoped it was the second or third choice. He didn't even want to think about how difficult and dangerous climbing down the handholds would be. The Eyrie was cold and lifeless when the king entered it some time later, the light outside having faded. There were no lords or servants living here, and there wouldn't be any until the spring, so the small castle of 7 towers was dark and freezing. Aegon found and managed to light a single torch, navigating through the castle by its orange glow and decade-old memories. No one was certain just where Balerion denned in the Eyrie. The dragon had only been seen flying to and from the castle, having lasted all of one night at the Gates of the Moon before spreading his wings and flying back to where he had spent nearly all of his time until that point. He would periodically fly back down to join the feeding of his siblings, terrifying the residents there and pleasing Daenerys to no end. But the black and crimson beast never stayed long after the feeding ended. In hindsight, there was no guarantee Balerion even denned here at all. Perhaps he simply enjoyed flying around the highest mountain in Westeros, and Aegon had risked his life for nothing. That theory festered in his mind until he came upon the blackened and cracked bones of something roughly the size of a hog. Balerion's den was in the only truly logical place it could be, the garden. As Aegon held his torch higher, casting more light around the pitch black of the open space, he saw great piles of scattered skeletons, each blackened from fire and cracked from crunching jaws. The shrubbery had been turned into blackened sticks, and many of the pieces of statuary spread throughout the former garden bore scorch marks. Aegon saw bones belonging to what he guessed to be goats, hogs, deer, perhaps even a cow or two. Balerion had clearly spent most of his time hunting, Aegon taking in every detail of the beast's den in fascination. He didn't realize how poor of an idea walking into a strange dragon's home was until he saw the light of his torch reflected in a pair of great eyes. Aegon froze, realizing his foolishness only as the sound of Balerion uncurling his body reached his ears, accompanied by a low, ground-shaking growl. The black pools of the eyes, which had been lower to the ground, slowly rose up and up and up. Aegon watched, terrified and exhilarated, as the animal of his family's sigil started towards him, ground moving with each step the beast took. The king didn't move because wasn't able, too in awe of what he was seeing, to even attempt to run. Balerion was big, much bigger than either of his siblings. Perhaps it was due to his inclination to hunt his own game, whereas Aelin and Regal allowed most of their meals to be brought to them. As the quantity of bones spread around the garden made clear, this dragon was eating plenty and often. Perhaps Balerion was simply a bigger dragon, just as there were runts and brutes in other species. Whatever the reasoning, the monster was nearly twice again as big as the others, bared teeth black as obsidian, and he was looming over Aegon, shaking the Dragon Lord's soul with his rumbling growl. I didn't think of what I'd do when I reached this point. What did I think would work, saying, "Hello, I'm a king, may I please ride you?" Aegon stared up at the dragon over top him, terrified and mystified and confused as to why he wasn't already dead. Is it my Targaryen blood? Can he sense it? Swallowing, the king of Westeros began to slowly raise his hand, extending it towards Balerion. It was the most foolish thing he had done yet. With a roar that nearly left Aegon deaf, Balerion shot forward, massive head rushing towards him like the strike of a viper. Aegon let out a cry, stumbling backwards both from fear and the sheer force of the dragon darting at him. The king fell to the ground of blackened bones, torch rolling away from his hand, violet eyes shut against the coming pain of a dragon snapping him in two, but he still wasn't dead. Hesitantly, Aegon opened his eyes, first the right then the left. His vision was filled with the snout of a dragon, teeth bared but not in the process of crushing the king's skull. Balerion stood over top him, eyes two pools of fire as his nostrils sniffed the odd being trapped below him. The dragon's snout slowly smelled from Aegon's boots back up his body until Balerion's nose nearly pressed against his face. Aegon stared up at the beast, not daring to so much as twitch a muscle. Balerion sniffed him once more, and then exhaled so forcefully that it fluttered Aegon's silvery hair. Abruptly, he was no longer looming over the being he could so clearly make a snack of, the ground beneath Aegon's back rumbling as the dragon roared into the night sky. The king watched from his lying position, hypnotized as Balerion ran on his two hind legs, flapping his great wings twice before he became airborne. The king of the Iron Throne slowly sat up, eyes fixated on where he caught the last glimpse of Balerion, surrounded by a garden of burnt stone and blackened bone. Jaehaerys hadn't been lying when he said you could smell them before you could see them. The dragon of Duskendale stood a few paces to the front of the longest line of men Aelor had ever known of Westeros fielding, the scent of death and decay swirling in his nostrils. They stretched nearly out of sight to either side of him, the long line of shields and spears resting silent as men and women waited. They were stacked behind one another, the second waiting 100 yards behind the first. Between the two defenses, a deep trench had been dug, implementing the tactics of the survivors of Winterfell by dousing it with lantern oil. Archer towers, hastily built by the abundance of men who had been waiting, were dotted around the lines, crossbowmen and longbowmen waiting with stacks of cloth-wrapped arrows and braziers for lighting them. Aelor turned to look at one, where his eldest surviving child waited. Aemon had never been a warrior and wasn't a good shot, but he volunteered to remain behind and reload for crossbowmen, claiming this was everyone's war. Aelor was terrified for him. He'd already lost 2 children and the death of a third would kill him, but he was also fiercely proud. The white dragon turned back around, peering at the field of white and wildfire. The jars had been stacked at key points in the terrain, in naturally occurring trenches where the dead were likely to funnel, and in choke points the defenders had made by throwing up barricades to try and influence the dead's advance. The most accurate shots in all of the combined armies stood ready to target them and fire, equipped with the Golden Heart bows that had been taken from the dead and captured archers of the Golden Company. Catapults, the same simple and quick-to-build design Aelor had implemented 2 decades earlier at Casterly Rock, stood just behind the second line, long lines of barrels of burning pith ready to fling at the enemy. The living were as prepared as they could be for the dead. Aelor supposed they would soon find out if it was prepared enough. King Aegon VI had not returned. Aelor didn't know what that meant. Perhaps he was on his way, perhaps the dragons hadn't been big enough, or perhaps he was even dead. Some men had grumbled that the king had abandoned them, forsaking his own people in face of a reportedly infinite foe. The White Dragon himself hoped his nephew showed up either with a dragon or he didn't show up at all. He had already told Aemon and Balon there was no shame in fleeing if this fight became hopeless. He imagined Aemon would follow the command. His second-born had grown in force of personality and toughness over all he had seen, but he had never tasted battle. Balon likely wouldn't follow that command no matter how overwhelming the opposition became. His fourth-born had tasted battle, and he had found the taste sweeter than anything else in life. Balon would only leave this field if he was victorious or he was dead. That was all well and good, for Aelor had the same determination. Do you suppose Lucerys will fare well? Aelor wished desperately he could have met his grandson. Perhaps he still would if the day was won, but Aelor knew the likelihood of that was small. Alaric pondered the question for a moment from Aelor's side. What do you mean, he's only an infant? He had been as blindsided by the knowledge of a grandson as the dragon of Duskendale had been, and Aelor didn't know if he was thrilled or furious. Both men had been pleased to hear that Alysanne, Cersei and Tyrion had been savvy enough to cover the marriage up with the story of a rushed marriage, but Aelor wondered if the skepticism it was surely met with would negatively affect Lucerys' position as Aelor's heir. In all legality, the infant truly wasn't, as his birth was in truth that of a bastard, but Aelor would kill any man who questioned Lucerys. But Aelor might not live out the day, in which case there was call for concern. I mean, if I don't live out the day. I doubt Aemon would ever have any intention of trying to usurp him, and Balon has never shown any interest in ruling over anything other than a sword, but still, Alaric answered after a moment more of deliberation. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, Miachella and Renler were married. The only ones who know otherwise aren't likely to tell the truth. He's the grandson of Aelor, cousin of Aegon and great-nephew to the Lord of the Westerlands. Not to mention he'll have Alysanne Lefford and Cersei Lannister fighting for his rights. I dare say he'll do better than either of us ever did. Aelor nodded, gazing on ahead. Alysanne had followed the non-fighter south less than an hour ago, remaining with her sons and husband until the scent had rallied the defenders to their positions. He already missed her fiercely, and part of his mind wondered how she would do without him. His wife had always had a strength unseen in most nobles, a strength that had allowed her to survive years of marriage to a man many saw as a monster. She'll do well, they'll all do well. Of course, I can always just survive this and make sure they will. Yes, let's try for that. So the dragon of Duskendale stood and waited as the stench of decay grew ever stronger. When his violet eyes caught distant movement in the dredges of the swamps leading south, Aelor ordered the defenders to stand ready. The order was repeated up and down the long lines, men who had been standing somewhat relaxed tensing, shield wall growing closer together and spearmen gripping their weapons in preparation. Randyll Tarly had command of the left, Sir Barristan the Bold the right. Balon Swan had command of the archers, and Mace Tyrell was as out of the way as he could be in command of the catapults. His son Garland, the fierce swordsman, was in the center. He would fight alongside Aelor and Balon today. The snow, which had been so fierce and constant for weeks now, suddenly and abruptly stopped. Aelor looked up to the gray skies overhead, pondering the occurrence. Sailors always say the eye of a storm is calm. That makes sense, the others bring the storm after all. Aelor watched as the horizon slowly turned from white snows and the stumps of the trees the royalist had chopped down to a mass of cloth and armor, covering shambling beings that gained speed as whatever they used for consciousness registered the army of living before them. There were so many of them Aelor couldn't even begin to estimate their numbers, a literal ocean of dead coming for them. Even at a distance he could see the furs of wildings, the leathers of Northmen, the black of brothers of the Night's Watch and the armor of southern knights and lords. The dragon of Duskendale took a deep breath, letting it leave his lungs in a slow exhale. He looked over to the tall lord of the Brindlewood beside him, holding out a gauntlet and saying something he hadn't in 18 years. "Are you with me, Alaric?" And as always Alaric took the proffered gauntlet and replied, "To the death, your grace." Aelor looked back to the approaching tide of dead, lowering his white-flamed helmet over his Targaryen silver hair as Alaric turned to go to his command. The dragon of Duskendale drew his sword and held it high in the air, hearing the sound of thousands of other blades leaving their scabbards. The white dragon stared into the heart of the approaching storm. They spread as far or farther than Aelor's own lines, seemingly large enough to wrap around them twice. Alaric, Oberyn Martell, Arthur Dayne and young Ardes Arryn were in command of 4 separate forces of cavalry, under orders to rush to where they were needed, be it a threatened flank or a faltering point in the lines. Aelor didn't bother to turn and see if they were already reacting. He trusted his men to do as was best, even the young Lord of the Vale. There were too many dead to truly funnel as the living had intended them to, but enough avoided the barricades or fell into the natural dips in the terrain. The archers fired as one, bunches of burning arrows flying through the sky to land around the wildfire catches as the catapults launched barrels of pitch. Aelor knew what was coming, and braced himself against the coming explosions. He was taken back to a time outside of a now-dead city when the world exploded with a great green light, the force sweeping across them. Aelor stood against it, feeling the force of it batter against him as he watched dismembered body parts fly into the air amidst clouds of snow and ground. He heard the gasp of shock from those behind him, heard armor and weapons rattle as men were knocked down. More explosions soon shook them, but Aelor kept his feet staring towards the enemy. The dead kept coming. Aelor had known they would, but he had hoped nonetheless. Great gaping holes had been opened in their ranks from the wildfire that still burned all across the field, but more dead soon filled them. Groans of despair sounded behind him as the men and women saw the relentless advance, the last of the wildfire holdings exploding in a shower of blood and green flame. Aelor turned to the 2 lines behind him, looking first to the left and then following the lines all the way to the right. He was a man alone in front of the lines, a black speck against the white snow with a tide of enemies rushing towards his back. Aelor raised both his sword and his voice, shouting over the sound of firing catapults, burning wildfire and snarling dead. "Is that all that it takes to dishearten the men of Westeros?" A few voices shouted a quiet negative. Aelor shook his head, raising his voice even louder. "I asked, is that all that it takes to dishearten the men of Westeros?" More voices, dozens of them, answered him. No. Others along the lines turned to look at the Dragonlord to their front, taking their eyes from the terrifying waves of death approaching them. Aelor wasn't done. He yelled, louder than even he knew he could bellow. "We are alive. I aim to stay that way. What say you?" The answer was hundreds of voices this time. More and more men and women turning to watch their leader. Some likely couldn't hear what he was saying, but they shouted anyway. The response was more of a wordless bellow than a true answer, but Aelor took heart in it all the same. I say we put the dead back into the ground. Who we fight for our sons. Who we fight for our daughters. Who we fight for the living. Who swords slammed against shields, spears were thrust into the air. Banners waved and horses screamed. The Black Ocean was close to Aelor, close enough that they would be all over the lines at any second. Aelor didn't turn. Instead, he thrust both his sword and shield into the air, holding his arms to the heavens as he shouted again. He let his final word morph into a long, guttural war cry, one that every living man and woman present would echo. Fire and blue who still screaming and violet eyes blazing. The dragon of Duskendale spun, in the same motion bringing his raised sword down in a vicious strike. The blade cleaved a half-rotted man in two through his chest, Aelor beheading another with the backstroke, wading into the ocean of dead. All 7 hells were unleashed. He still wasn't dead. Aegon took that as a positive sign, mainly because it was the only one Balerion had given him. He had been at the Eyrie for 7 days. And he hadn't accomplished any of the 3 options he was supposed to accomplish in 2. He had scourged the Eyrie for parchment and quill, writing a letter telling Mya to leave for the Gates of the Moon. He had tied it to a rock and thrown it from the precipice towards the Waycastle of Sky, hoping Mya would investigate its clatter and do as he said. It had taken him 6 times writing the same missive and 6 throws before he got one near the small castle far down the slope of the Giant's Lance. The King of the Iron Throne had taken only enough food for the 2 days he was supposed to have been here, and had taken to subsiding on a dangerous food source. He would scavenge Balerion's most recent kill once the dragon took flight for another, using his dagger to carve off small chunks of scorched meat. It tasted terrible and half the time wasn't cooked completely through, but it was better than the nothing he would otherwise have. Supplies and food in particular were valuable resources in the winter, and nothing had been left in the Eyrie when the Arryns left for the Gates of the Moon. It was risky business, going anywhere near a dragon's recent kill, but Balerion had proven time and again that he wasn't interested in outright killing the silver-haired 2-legged being. He had come to accept Aegon's presence as long as the king kept his distance, paying him little attention and showing no aggression unless Aegon tried to draw too close to him. Even then the dragon would only roar and rise to his legs, and Aegon would slowly back away. It was hard to ride a dragon if you couldn't even get within 10 feet of one. The king was in a constant state of freezing, all stalks of wood having been taken down the mountain with the Arryns as well. He'd managed to light some of the garden's shrubbery that Balerion hadn't already turned into cinders, and the walls of the Eyrie kept him from the wind, but those supplies were running low as well. Something needed to change, but be damned if Aegon had any idea of how to make it happen. Aegon peered out of the Moon Tower, the bedchamber of the Lord of the Vale that the king had taken as his own while he tried to plot his next move. Balerion was in the garden, gnawing on the skull of a bull he had likely stolen from some farmer that morning. His eating habits seemed to differ on the dragon's moods. Sometimes he would bring fresh kills back and devour them slowly. Sometimes he would return with a mass of burnt fur and flesh and chomp it down quickly. Aegon imagined the dragon likely ate a number of his meals wherever he killed them, feeding his voracious appetite at a rate that nearly matched his growth. I'm supposed to ride you. There's a prophecy, prince that was promised, all of that good stuff. Balerion actually looked up towards where Aegon leaned halfway out the window, glancing at the king in seeming mockery before returning to the skeleton he was savaging. With a sigh he walked back towards the bed, throwing himself across it in frustration. He couldn't very well save his army from whatever fate was descending on them from here, but he also couldn't return to the Gates of the Moon as a failure. What kind of Targaryen am I when a dragon won't even let me touch him? Some blood of old Valyria I'm proving to be. Aegon racked his brain for every bit of dragon lore Grandmeister Calmer had driven into his mind, but it hadn't given him anything useful the last 7 days and didn't give him anything now. Many dragon riders had been given their future mounts when the dragons hadn't even hatched. Aegon imagined Dany would have a much better chance of mounting Balerion than Aegon did. But each dragon only ever had 1 rider at a time, and each dragon rider only had 1 dragon at a time, not 3. Perhaps he should have tried to mount Aelin or Regal, but neither dragon seemed large enough to carry his muscled form. Other past dragon riders, like Meager the Cruel, had claimed dragons after their dragon rider had died. Aegon didn't rightly know just how they did so, as the process had never seemed to be something he should learn. Dragons were supposed to be extinct after all. He remembered the story of how Nettles, one of the dragon riders during the Dance of the Dragons, had left a dead sheep a day for Sheepstealer, building trust between the two. That would work swimmingly if it wasn't for the fact that Balerion was keeping Aegon fed, as there was no way he could traverse down the slope. Kill something with his sword or dagger, then climb back up carrying it. Other Targaryens had the advantage of the dragon pit, a controlled space where the dragons resided. Aelor had the open garden of the Eyrie and a steep fall down its sides. Such was his predicament. It wasn't kingly to pout, but Aegon had been doing a fair bit of pouting over the last 7 days. He assumed Balerion was just grumbling when he first heard the dragon make a sound and thusly ignored it. But when he heard the explosion, horribly distant but still audible to him, the king rose to a sitting position on the stripped bed, furling his eyebrows in confusion. More explosions followed, each likely miles away but the sound carrying even to the highest mountain. Aegon supposed he wasn't overly far from where Aelor and those would wage war, at least not as a dragon flies. If I could only ride the damn dragon, I'd find out for myself. Only one thing Aegon knew of could make that sort of sound. And only vast amounts of it would make it loud enough to be heard this far away. Wildfire. I'm too late, the dead are upon the living, and I'm too far away to be of any use. Aegon sprinted out of the tower, rushing down the steps before rushing out of the tower onto the walls of the Eyrie, leaning against the parapets. He stared to the northwest, where a mountain range and a section of the riverlands separated him from where his people waged a war for their very existence. He couldn't see anything through the falling snow and dark skies. But Aegon knew in his heart just what was happening. A reptilian rumble shifted his attention to Balerion down in the garden. The great black dragon had risen to his legs and forearms, snake-like neck craned back as his large nostrils sniffed the air. The black dragon let out a short, loud roar, and far below Aegon at the foot of the giant's lance echoed the cries of his siblings. Aegon cocked his head, watching as Balerion scraped first one clawed foot and then the other across the garden's ground. And then, ground shaking, he took off at a run. Aegon watched him for a moment, sprinting parallel below where Aegon stood on the wall. The idea came to him suddenly with a punch of anxiety, fear, and exhilaration. In order to mount the dragon he needed to get close to him, and Balerion had prevented that. But even if he would, that would end with Aegon on Balerion's back. Balerion's back was right there. Aegon's legs were sprinting less than a second into the thought, the sound of Balerion's pounding wings filling the air. The king's mind was running even faster than his body, telling him to stop now while he still had a life. If I can even land on his back, what if I can't hang on? How do I steer him? What if he rolls mid-flight? Can he roll mid-flight? This is a terrible idea, an absolutely worst idea I've ever had. Stop, 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 stop. He had one last thought as Balerion began to rise into the air. Well, at least I'd have done something to try and help my kingdom. Even if it was to fall to my death. The king of the Iron Throne leapt. Aemon had always thought he would make a shit soldier. He was right. Yet the second son of Aelor clung to a rickety archer tower, reloading crossbow after crossbow for the men around him. His arms ached from pulling the strings back, fingers bleeding in several places from where he had nicked himself on the steel or iron points of the crossbow bolts. The world around him had resorted to a bloody mess. Where once there had been an orderly line to the front, now there was a mass of dead and living laying into one another with reckless abandon. Shouts and screams filled the air, accompanied by the roar of the still-burning wildfire and otherworldly snarls of corpses. Aemon had only been able to watch as his father disappeared into the ocean of steel, the collective war cry he had started, so contagious that even he, quiet and bookish Aemon, had joined, still echoing across the battlefield. Dead had leapt onto the top of the lines, crashing against the forest of spears and shields. The battle had engulfed everything, now raging all around the bottom of his tower and in the oil-covered trench behind him. It still hadn't been lit, though in several places all along the front the dead had pushed through and engaged the second line. Aemon from his position high above the melee could still see his father, a bubble of whirling steel far ahead of where the first line had once been. Balin and Jaehaerys, both having been in the center, had somehow found their way to him. A rock of 3 sword-wielding Targaryens dealing death to the dead. Aemon would occasionally glance over at his kinsmen as he continued reloading crossbows as fast as he could, throwing them into the hands of the men around him. One was a deaf black brother aptly called Deaf Dick Follard, the old man able to aim and fire quickly with great accuracy. Another was a Valeman man-at-arms sworn to house hunter named Hugo. A third a lordling from the Reach named Ben Kai who had served as the wounded Sir Roland Storm's squire. There were 4 others on the tower, 3 archers and a young wildling girl that was, like Aemon, reloading. Aemon's body acted on instinct, pulling the string back, setting the mechanism, loading a bolt, and then handing that ready crossbow to one of the archers, taking the empty one from their hands and setting to reloading it. It was a simple, mindless process that he did over and over, fingers becoming raw, the sound of snarling dead all around him. He glanced out either at his father or at the battle as a whole only periodically, but he could see the tide turning. Catapults still fired barrels of burning pitch into the mass of dead, men and women still fought in a bloody melee. And archers like those on his tower still fired bolt after bolt and arrow after arrow. Fire was everywhere, both the green of wildfire and the orange of normal flame. But Aemon could see the number of living, already outnumbered, steadily dwindling around him. Ben Kai saw the same, the young lordling with peach fuzz dropping his crossbow and drawing his sword, leaping from the tower to the mess of gore below. Another of the archers, a bearded man the wildling girl was keeping resupplied, turned and leapt from the other side of the tower, looking more like he was intending to flee than join the battle. The second line had become fully engaged, the forces of cavalry long ago having ridden to where they seemed most needed. The living were losing and the White Walkers hadn't even arrived yet. Aemon was so terrified he wanted nothing more than to follow the bearded man in his flight. Instead he stayed on his tower, reloading crossbow after crossbow, trying desperately to block the sounds of pain and terror all around him. The wildling girl, fair Alara, saw at first eyes opening in terror as she pointed behind Aemon. The Targaryen with leopard features whirled around and to his utmost terror saw the rotting arms of a wight in the process of pulling himself onto the platform, dagger in its bony hand. Aemon looked to Deaf Dick, who was aiming his crossbow entirely oblivious to the threat. Fallard. The old man didn't move and the wight's head came into view. Fallard. The black brother still didn't move, trying to pick a target out of the mass of bodies below. Of course he can't hear me, he's called Deaf Dick. As the wight snarled, pulling its decaying body onto the platform, Aemon lurched forward. He snatched the dagger out of Fallard's belt, turning and throwing all his strength into a stab towards the dead man. The blade sank into its eerie blue eyes, gut-wrenching cry cut short as the blade stabbed into his already dead brain. Aemon yelled, half war cry, half terrified scream. As he withdrew the blade, the wight tumbling down atop the bodies alive and reanimated below. Aemon stared after it in shock before he hesitantly raised his eyes, glancing around the battlefield once more. It was worse than it had been the last time he looked, more and more living turning to flee despite their compatriots hollering for them to stay and fight, for there was nowhere south enough to escape. The trench had somehow been lit, separating the battle into two separate entities, but the second line was as jumbled as the first had been, a massive melee that turned the ground red and brown and covered in dead. One of the catapults was swarmed with wights and most of the others had gone silent. We're losing. The dead are prevailing against the living and there is nothing we can do to stop it. Aemon swore it was his imagination when he heard the guttural roar. He looked up anyway, he didn't want his last sights to all be of walking corpses and dying men. Three figures soared in the skies, growing ever closer and bigger. Aemon squinted towards them, trying to determine what in the sake of the seven they were. When he realized, Aemon nearly fell off of the tower. Seven, save me, I'm seeing dragons. One was bigger than the other two combined, all three roaring as they neared the slaughter field. Steam rose from their scales. The largest red and crimson, one white and gold, the third green and bronze. Their great wings beat against the air, cutting through the skies quickly. And perched on two of them, one the black and the other the white, were two figures. Aemon didn't know where they had come from, he didn't know how any of it was possible. He had no bloody clue if he wasn't just seeing a hallucination. Perhaps he was already dying, and this was the last dreams of a dying man. He also didn't know who one of the riders was, but he had no doubt of the identity of the other. Aemon may not have been much of a fighter, but he could yell when he wanted to. Look to the skies, the king comes, dragons, fight, fight for your king. Little by little men or women would look up and see the approaching figures. Some would die, frozen by the sight and being killed by those they were fighting. Others turned and sprinted all the faster. Their already maximized terror growing longer. Yet more took up the call and a spirit re-entered the beaten forces. Of the living, Aemon stood on his tower, bloody dagger in one hand, screaming as loud as his underused lungs would scream. The survivors fought harder, shouting for their king, shouting of a sign from the seven or just shouting mindlessly. Some laughed hysterically, others cried, many died. And then the dragons swooped low, three plumes of fire spreading across the ocean of whites. Aelor nearly leapt out of his skin, when a stream of fire swept across the whites a few feet to his front. It was odd that anything could take him by surprise in this field of terror and disbelief. He was fighting beings that should have been dead long ago, their guts hanging from their split bellies, their faces desiccated or rotting, eyes icy blue and dead. More than one had attacked Aelor while still burning, covered in green fire, screeching a terrible broken war cry. Aelor had dismembered them, crushed their skulls, cleaved their bodies in half, yet more just kept coming. He screamed, he gouged, he fought, and it had all seemed for nothing. But as the whites to his front burst into flame, Aelor looked to the skies in shock. Swooping over him was a cream and golden dragon. A dragon. Aelor had believed his wife was telling the truth about the animal that adorned his family's banner. He'd sent the king in search of them. After all, but he was in no way prepared for the real thing. As the dragon swooped over, Aelor spied a figure on its back, too small to be Aegon. The hair was shorter, but Aelor recognized his sister instantly. Daenerys Stormborn, coming to battle like Visenya Targaryen of old. Aelor's spirit soared, his blood nearly singing. Shouts of the king dragons for the living echoed somewhere behind him, and Aelor added a wordless roar of his own. Balin and Jaehaerys were somewhere near him, their own shouts of elation joining his. It was as if dragonfire was burning through his body, and Aelor loved every moment of it. Aelor cut through the dead like they were made of snow, bashing them aside, every swing of the sword killing the dead. He rushed a wildling's head with his shield, decapitated a former knight, snapped the brittle arm bones of a decayed black brother before stabbing him through the eye. He laughed as dragons roared overhead. This was what he had fought his entire life for. Dragons had returned, the symbol of Targaryen power that had been lost to them a century earlier restored. He spotted Aegon upon a massive black dragon, his nephew's face alight with a vicious grin as he swooped overhead. It was mirrored on Aelor's. The bloodbath continued, always more enemies no matter how many they chopped down. Aelor and his sons had been an island far ahead of the rest of the force for a long portion of the battle. But not long after the arrival of Aegon and Daenerys, Aelor began to see more of the living around him. They were gaining ground, emboldened by the arrival of their king and princess atop creatures long thought dead, the living finally making progress against the dead. They made so much progress, in fact, that they drew the true enemy onto the battlefield. The White Walkers were as Jaehaerys and Jaime had described, icy blue skin, horribly blue eyes, hair as white as snow. The Walkers tore into the survivors, replacing the numbers their whites had brought with their sheer indestructibility. Aelor saw swords shatter, armor part like skin under a maester's blade. The revitalized army of the living were soon shattered again, some turning to flee despite the dragons continuously raising the army of the dead. Aelor stood detached from it all, watching as the last hope seemed to flee amidst a rash of icy demons. And then he saw him. There was no mistaking this particular other. The ice of his head was shaped like a crown, two of his kind beside him like bodyguards. He wasn't participating in the battle, instead calmly strolling through the field of death and destruction, watching the unfolding slaughter. He was dressed in black studded leather, a sword sheathed across his back, walking as if he owned the world. He doesn't yet. To kill the body, you remove the head. The dragon of Duskendale bashed aside a white and broke into a sprint, leaping over the piles of bodies towards the Night's King. He didn't know how he was going to do it. His sword was simple steel, good work but not otherworldly. It didn't matter though. If today was going to be the day mankind would fall, Aelor intended to go out as he had lived. The chief ice demon saw him, grotesque face unmoving as he registered the black-armored being charging at him with reckless abandon. Instead of drawing his own weapon or moving to avoid, he simply twitched his hand towards Aelor as if he was an annoying fly. The two bodyguards instantly moved to intercept him, both raising their icy weapons. Aelor readied himself as they drew close, having no real plan but to swing and swing hard. And suddenly a dragon dropped out of the sky. Aelor was forced to dive to the side as the black dragon crashed to the ground, his nephew atop it, landing atop the two advancing White Walkers, clawed feet smearing them across the field as the great beast slid to a stop. The black dragon roared as Aelor gained his feet, darting his neck forward to snatch a white, tossing it into the air and then down his gullet. And off of his back leapt the king of the Iron Throne, Blackfire raised as he screamed a battle cry. Valyrian steel. The prince that was promised. Rhaegar's proclamations. It all flew through Aelor's mind as he rushed to join his nephew in battle. The Night's King met the living king's charge, and just as Jaehaerys had claimed, Blackfire did not shatter. Instead, the two blades collided, smoky black and sheer ice giving off a terrible clang as they did. The Night's King parried Aegon once, twice, and then Aelor was at his side. The hand of the king's sword was not Valyrian steel. The other's blade met his, and the ruby-pommeled blade that had claimed so many lives shattered in Aelor's grip. Aelor stared in shock at the useless grip in his hand, arm vibrating from the blow, before an icy hand slammed his helmet upside the head. The dragon of Duskendale went flying, the blow ringing his ears and buckling his knees despite the seemingly careless way it had been delivered. It was as if Gregor Clegane had come again, swatting him into the wall of Aegon's nursery as the mountain had done so long ago. He hit the ground with a ferocious exhale, whirled swimming. Looking up through those swimming eyes, Aelor saw his nephew battle the ice demon. The Night's King was faster and infinitely stronger, and though he couldn't destroy Aegon's blade, he could still outduel him. It became abundantly clear to Aelor that that was about to happen. The dragon of Duskendale regained his feet, wobbly from the blow to the head, and staggered towards where Aegon grew more and more taxed, though there was nothing Aelor could do. The king in the Iron Throne was losing ground rapidly, the Night's King's icy blade everywhere at once. Aelor increased his pace, though he still had to focus on each step, stumbling over the uncountable number of bodies littering the ground. 3 blows from the Night's King sent Aegon to his knees, and then a savage two-handed swing sent Blackfire from the King of the Iron Throne's grip. The Night's King's icy lips twitched into a semblance of a smirk, and he drew his blade back. Aelor sprinted forward. The Night's King drove the blade forward in a stab aim for Aegon's chest, the Targaryen dragon rider defenseless. With a throaty roar, the dragon of Duskendale crashed into the Night's King, taking the blow meant for his nephew. The other's blade stabbed through Aelor's armor like butter, plunging through his guts and out his back. And with another strangled war cry of rage, elation, and pain, Aelor's hands wrapped around the White Walker's wrist, trapping his blade. The icy contact burned Aelor's hands even through his gauntlets, but he did not let go. The King of the True North pulled at his blade embedded in Aelor's innards. And while it jerked the hand of the king forward, and tore up more of his insides, he did not relinquish his grip or the blade. Icy eyes met violet ones, and Aelor let out a pain-filled chuckle. The Night's King's head snapped around as Aegon reappeared at his side, Blackfire swooping in, the King of Westeros sounding for all the world like the dragon he rode as he shouted. Aelor saw the other's face contort in otherworldly terror before he shattered into a million pieces. The wrist Aelor was gripping, and the sword he was trapping following suit. The dragon of Duskendale grunted in pain, hands pressing against the split steel over his belly, and fell to the corpse-covered ground. 1 second Aemon had been fighting as whites swarmed his archer's tower, stabbing and slashing with dead deaf Dick Follard's dagger, and the next they just fell to the ground. Aemon stared in confusion as the whites that had been very much moving seconds earlier lie motionless over the field. The wildling girl, Farah was definitely her name, and she and Aegon were the only survivors of their crossbow team, peeked out from behind him, tear tracks down her face. Aemon looked around, from the burning ditch to the fiery swaths Dragonfire had made. Where earlier there had been whites and White Walkers, now there were only men standing in various states of confusion, their swords raised to parry blows that had been smashing towards them. Corpses covered the ground as far as the eye could see, more than could be counted. But there were no standing dead, no White Walkers. All that was left was the living, few of them, so few it overwhelmed Aemon's mind, but living nonetheless. "We've done it, we've won." A laugh escaped him then, sharp and disbelieving in its own sound. Farah clutched him from behind, her small head, she couldn't be more than 10, pressing against his back. Aemon laughed louder, whirling to grab the wildling into a ferocious hug. "We've done it, just as the men of old did. We've prevented the long night." He whirled Farah around the rickety, bloody archer's tower, laughing as hysterically as anyone ever had. But that laughter died when Aemon spotted Balon sprinting across the field, Jaehaerys limping along behind him, to where a figure was crouched between 2 of the dragons, holding a third in his arms. Aemon was off the tower and sprinting over the carnage before Farah realized he had moved. He knew it was his father before he even found the ring of people. The dragons were all over the suddenly sparse field, gobbling corpses old and new. The mystery rider, whom Aemon could now see was his Aunt Daenerys, stood next to the crouched man, tears down her pretty grim-covered face. Balon was holding her, bleeding from a nasty cut across the bridge of his nose, the always emotionless brother's eyes also filling with tears. Aemon had passed Jaehaerys, his cousin gripping a bleeding thigh as he hobbled. His other cousin, the King of the Iron Throne, sat in the snow holding a man in his lap. Blood covered the king's legs, clearly hemorrhaging out of the lying man's back. His father's hands were pressed to his stomach, blood flowing between and around them. Aemon let out a strangled cry as he fell to the snow beside them. His father was taking shallow, pained breaths, body occasionally twitching. His violet eyes, racked with pain, found Aemon. A weak smile covered his face, his voice weak and faint, the words coming at great cost. "I knew you were a dragon, son." Aegon spoke in his king voice, though it wavered. Tears fell down his face as well. "You are not allowed to die. I am your king. You will not die. Am I understood?" Aelor coughed a bloody cough, looking up at his nephew leaned over him. "Rhaegar was right. You are the prince that was promised." "No, uncle, you cannot go. I command you to live. For once in your life, heed me, please." Suddenly the convulsions in his father's body stopped, his violet eyes going unfocused and unseeing. A great bloody smile crossed a face that was suddenly at peace, a hand reaching up to pat his nephew's cheek. When Aelor spoke this time, his voice was strong as Aemon had ever heard it. "Your mother is as beautiful as ever. But tell Alysanne I loved her most. Don't worry, Aaliyah understands. The hand fell to the side, and with an exhale that sounded to all gathered like a roar, the dragon of Duskendale breathed his last. King Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of his name, stood on a balcony of the Red Keep overlooking his city, sunlight bathing his upturned face. Winter had not ended with the death of the Night's King, but the days of near-constant snow had. Sun, which had seemed to have taken a year's hiatus from the world of men, had returned, popping its bright head out of the gray skies to give the battered and bleeding lands of Westeros a respite from the cold. Snow still fell often and the air was still bitterly cold, but every now and again they were blessed with a ray of sunshine. Your Grace, not one moment of peace it seems. Oh, to be but a peasant boy, but Aegon wasn't now and never had been a peasant boy. He was a king, the king despite recent attempts to claim the title, and a king never truly rested. Westeros had prevented a long night, but there was not an easy road left to it. There would be pain and suffering to come. Just as there was pain and suffering behind them, life was a vicious cycle. I heard you the first time, Arthur. The king opened his violet eyes, turning to face the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the only healthy Kingsguard I have left. Legendary Barristan the bold and strong Balon Swan had been among the countless dead of the Second Battle for the Dawn, dying in service to their liege. Born of the Bramsfort, Manfred Dark and Oswell had done so as well, the last in a battle, the middle in a betrayal, and the last in a falling wall. That left only one fighting man, the Sword of the Morning, as defense to his liege, Roland Storm, still at the gates of the moon to recover from his shattered ribs. I suppose their replacements will be one of our first orders of business. But then again, a Kingsguard can't follow me into the sky. Neither can a council. Balerion and Aegon's relationship was a rocky one. The Black Dragon almost seemed to detest Aegon for having stolen that first ride atop him, ignoring any commands the king had given as he and his siblings scrounged the battlefield, gobbling corpses like a fat man did lemon cakes. There had certainly been plenty of corpses to go around. The casualties had been beyond counting, miles of land covered in great piles of dead. The army of the living that had once been over 50,000 strong had been reduced to less than half that, closer to a quarter, though it was hard to get a truly accurate count, and that didn't even begin to number the whites. But Balerion allowed Aegon near him without complaint now, and despite a large amount of dragony grumbling had allowed Aegon to ride him several times since. Not that he listened very well or at all. In the 2 months since the Second Battle for the Dawn, the great black beast had shown a tendency to up and fly away to wherever the hell he wanted to go. Aegon didn't know if it would take training, time, or reconstructing the dragon pit, but Balerion at least showed an inclination for him now that hadn't existed prior. Maybe it was even respect, but Aegon doubted that. I suppose we'll discuss the dragons as well, though the seven know none of us have any real knowledge about what to do. It'll be years of learning for all of us. Sir Arthur tilted his head slightly, the greatsword Dawn at his side. Your Grace. The council is waiting. There is much to be discussed. Aegon nodded, adjusting the pointed crown atop his head with a sigh. This is one thing I didn't miss during our time at war, Arthur. The Lord Commander gave a small, good-natured grimace. It was to be his first small council meeting, as it was the first time the appointed council had managed to convene in King's Landing after the destruction of the wars, and the mass amounts of snow had left them widespread. You leave me with such a bright outlook. I leave you with the truth, my friend, only the truth. Soon after, Aegon stepped into the familiar small council chamber, the long table and its high-backed chairs the same as they had always been. His advisors stood as he entered, same as they always had. Only the faces had changed, several new in the room and one constant scarred countenance noticeably absent. My lords, I apologize for the delay. It is not an excuse, but I was enjoying the sunshine. We have seen so terribly little of it lately. He nodded at their murmured pleasantries, then took his seat at the head of the table, gesturing for his lords to follow suit. He turned to look at the man nearest his right, an old face in a new position on the council. Lord Tyrion, I believe you have the docket. The halfman nodded, the hand of the kingpin proudly displayed on the breast of his crimson tunic. He was the first man to wear it in nearly 2 decades, for Aelor had never saw a point in the badge of office. Everyone in Westeros knew who he was, pin or no buggering pin. Aegon supposed everyone would recognize the dwarf lord of the Westerlands as well, but he clearly had no qualms about wearing the hand and quill. Yes, your grace, and the stack is considerable. One of our more pressing issues is what to do with the survivors of the Night's Watch. There is no wall to return to. And whatever the crimes that sent them there, they fought and died for the king during the Second Battle for the Dawn. A new voice to the council, soft but firm, was the first to speak. The new Grandmeister was a physical opposite to the old, a slightly built, short and decidedly Dornish man named Ulwick. He had been born into the knightly house Santagar, the the second child of the Sir of Spotswood near Sunspear, but had taken the chain and forsaken his surname before his 10th name day. His beard was black with a heavy peppering of grey, and Aegon supposed he had been a fair-of-face man in his youth. How many black brothers survived Lord Tyrion? 32 that have stayed in some semblance of a formation, waiting for further orders. It is highly likely many others have shed their black cloaks and disappeared into the small folk. Tyrion swallowed, likely unnoticed by most but not by Aegon. There are no men with feasible claims among them. So that potential political situation has been avoided. The king knew that held a particular point for Tyrion. Jaime was his elder brother, and there had been whispers even before the slaughter of the Neck that the former Kingsguard's claim was strong. Tyrion had been saved from that potential crisis when Jaime had fallen at the Neck, though Aegon was certain Tyrion would give up all claim to Casterly Rock if he could only have his brother back. The king would give up most anything for one more discussion with his uncle. Ulwick rubbed his trimmed beard, the olive-skinned Maester oblivious to the king's inner dialogue. Perhaps they could be conscripted into the gold cloaks at least for a period of time. I realize many of them are not the most trustworthy of individuals, but those who have remained show a semblance of loyalty. They could be required to serve for some amount of years depending on the severity of their crime, if they were ever guilty of one. Perhaps we could offer the incentive of allowing them to go their own way at the end of it. Aegon pursed his lips, nodding. The idea seemed viable enough to him, though there would likely be some slight alterations to be made. Still, he looked over to another new face, one whose appointment had been Aegon's decision and not the Citadel's. Sir Garth, your thoughts. Garth Hightower, known as Greysteel, was a younger brother of an old friend of Aelor's, Baelor Brightsmile, the heir to Old Town. The first had remained in the south, not venturing far since he lost his leg in the rebellion, but the second son had come to replace Bronze Yohn Royce as Justicar, the Lord of Runestone, falling in the savage but short fighting at the Red Keep when Viserys took it. Garth was tall and broad, not half as handsome as his crippled brother and a survivor of the second battle for the Dawn. Unmarried though near 40. He had led the considerable number of Hightower men through both of the recent wars. In truth, he wouldn't have been Aegon's first choice for the office of Master of Laws. Greysteel was known for questioning Aelor's brutal tactics even as he followed him during Robert's rebellion, and his temperament was not one well suited to making friends. But the only better options in Aegon's mind, Alaric Langward and Randall Tarley, had died like Aelor during the second battle for the Dawn. And Sir Garth was a strict defender of the law with a penchant for training men. Whatever his thoughts on Aelor, he would serve ably in the office. The knight nodded. I could use them. They'll have some notion of martial pursuits and organization and will prove useful in rebuilding the gold cloaks. With his grace's permission, I will begin recruiting from the small folk of the city as well. The Targaryen king nodded. You have it. Tyrion nodded, moving on without being told to do so. Also of importance and also to do with the fall of the wall is what to do with the wildlings. There are few of them, but they fought hard for your grace. They agreed to bend the knee once, perhaps they will keep them bent. Do you intend to rebuild the wall, your grace? Asked Sir Arthur, seated to the king's left. Aegon shook his head. I wouldn't even know how to begin, and the cost would be tremendous. The final new member of the council spoke up. His fingers ink-stained already, even though he had only been in the city for less than a week. Rebuilding the wall would be absurdly expensive, your grace, but the construction of a new castle would be more than manageable. Aegon raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? Alessander Steedman was nicknamed Pennylover, and the Lord of Broad Arch in the Stormlands certainly had a mind for business. Black of hair and green-eyed, he had a pug nose and large, almost club-like hands. There is more than just ice in the ruins of the wall. There is stone from the former castles. The wildlings have shown that they are willing to kneel, at least for now. I think we all would like to believe the others have been permanently dealt with, but we do not know that. My humble suggestion is that we excavate the wildlings another gate through which to return to their homes and turn the ruins into whatever fortifications we can. If we raise a castle and establish a loyal lord over the new holdings north of the old wall, subservient to House Stark, we not only try and maintain the wildlings' loyalty, but we also open ourselves up to a larger supply of goods from the forest to the north. Furs, wood, there is no telling what resources lie untouched. Stannis Baratheon, hero of the War of the Three Kings and the returning master of ships, said what was on everyone's mind. The wildlings followed Mance Rayder and only knelt when he persuaded them to. Now Mance Rayder is dead. Lord Alessander nodded in concession. That is true, Lord Stannis, but they fought even after Rayder was dead, even if it was for practical purposes. Their culture will not assimilate well to the south now that a unifying evil has been removed, pointed out Grandmeister Ulwick. Perhaps Lord Steedman has the right of it. Aegon was staring at the table. Mind tossing the idea around. There is only one southerner they will follow. I will talk to my brother and see his thoughts on the matter. He spoke to me once of how he felt he belonged in the north, and his relationship with the Starks is certainly a positive one. It is an excellent notion, Lord Steedman, and one certainly worth more thought. Tyrion was staring pointedly at Aegon with his mismatched eyes. Speaking of Prince Jaehaerys, Aegon let out a great sigh. I have told you, Lord Tyrion. I have no control over whom my brother believes his heart belongs to. Jaehaerys and Val have a bond forged from mutual suffering. It cannot be easily broken by the word of a brother, even if that brother is a king. Varys had gone to the Vale with Alysanne before simply appearing at the main army, managing spies throughout the War of Three Kings despite the heavy snows. Aegon didn't know the details of how Varys did what Varys did, and he was certain he didn't want to. Lord Tyrion has a right to be concerned. Many nobles are grumbling about the obvious relationship, even if Lady Val is considered by some to be a wildling princess. 2 years ago, Aegon would have slumped back in his chair, throwing his head back in exasperation at such an annoying issue. Now, though, he merely cocked an eyebrow. How do so many even know of it? We're not entirely certain which nobles are dead or not yet. Tyrion shrugged. Perhaps if they were not concerned that a future Targaryen king would have barbarian blood. Aegon sighed again, long and deep. Aegon knew his unwed status needed to be addressed, and soon. It was another of his duties and one of the most important/pleasurable ones at that. But Aegon was in no mood to discuss it, not now. We will handle that soon, Lord Tyrion, I promise you, but not today. I will discuss the plausibility of Lord Steedman's suggestion with Jaehaerys and Bran Stark both. For now, we move on. Sir Arthur spoke before Tyrion could. The matter of your Kingsguard, your grace. I have a list of potential candidates I think suitable for your review. Excellent, I already have one member decided, Balon Targaryen. There was a moment of silence before Stannis spoke, voice neither approving nor condemning. He is very young. I don't care for his age, I care for his ability to kill, and he does that better than nearly anyone present, myself included. I knighted him at the neck. And the only reason I didn't give him the white cloak then was my family's shared mourning for Prince Aelor. Greysteel seemed the most hesitant. The Kingsguard is an old order of the highest honor, your grace. Sir Balon is a very young man infamous for savagery. Some of the men were calling him Blooddragon, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. Aegon sat straight in his chair, his voice deepening along with his seriousness. I have discussed it with Balon, and he is willing. There is no man left alive, aside from my 2 present Kingsguard, whom I would more willingly trust with the lives of myself and my family. This is not a point of contention, my lords. I am not asking your opinion, I am informing you of my decision. Tyrion had the tact to instantly move on. As your grace says, next is the housing and feeding of the northern refugees while they remain in the south, and so it went. Hours were spent in that chamber. Details and decisions made in the dozens. Aegon missed Alysanne's guidance, but his surrogate mother had retired to Duskendale with Miachella, her youngest children and little Lord Lucerys serving as his regent. The decision was made to leave the Iron Islands be until an army could be built up and the dragons controlled, for nearly every fighting man in Westeros was either dead or infinitely weary of war, whenever it was deemed prudent. The severely weakened Ironborn would be given the chance to surrender their homes willingly. Those that didn't would be destroyed, for Aegon was adamant about changing the raiding culture even if it meant killing every surviving squid. The Iron Islands would be placed under the control of a loyal house, though which house it would be was left to be decided once the islands were cleansed. Matters of coin were discussed in excruciating detail. The expenses of the war high. Envoys were deemed necessary to send to the free cities to buy food and supplies for the northern refugees, as all stores of the northern houses had been picked clean during the flight. Ravens were to be spent to each of the Lord Paramounts to gather the states of the houses under their command, to gather an idea of who was still living and who was the heir in the cases of those that weren't. The bodies after the neck had been many and hard to distinguish. 2 of the Lord Paramounts present at the neck, Ardes Arryn and Edmure Tully, had been wounded, the latter severely, and Mace Tyrell had died, though his son Garland would survive. It was determined that Summerhall, former seat of Prince Viserys, would be granted to Jaehaerys if Jaehaerys didn't take the opportunity in the north, or to Daemon if he did. Aegon would write Alysanne, requesting betrothals of Dina, the eldest of Viserys' bastards, to Daemon and Daenella to Lucerys, to hopefully help prevent a future issue like that of the Blackfires. Aegon didn't know if Alysanne would accept in. Truth, the loss of Aelor so soon after Ren and Rhaella was very, very hard on her. Regardless, it was deemed the best way to handle the potential problems the twins could prove to be. Aegon had a pounding headache when he called the meeting to a close, his lords rising as he did. The king's joints cracked alarmingly as he straightened, violet eyes tired and bloodshot. "That is enough for today, my lords. We will reconvene tomorrow." He hadn't made it very far into his retreat before Tyrion called after him. "One last thing that needs to be addressed today, your grace. What of the prisoners from the Golden Company?" Aegon slowed to a stop. He had entirely forgotten about the influx of men that had been crowding the black cells of the Red Keep for months. Now that Lord Tyrion is an excellent question. The Golden Company had been part of half a dozen failed rebellions, each of which brought pain and suffering to the realm. Mercy had been shown in the past and been repaid with blood, but Aegon couldn't very well forget that among those imprisoned men was Lord Renly. "Stannis served me well during the War of the Three Kings. I can't well repay that loyalty by chopping his baby brother's head off, even if Renly's a traitor." The king contemplated a long moment before turning to face his advisors, expression a confident mask when he did. "These men have rebelled against the Targaryen kings time and time again, and no matter how many times they fail they always return to try again. My forebears have shown them mercy, and that mercy has done us no good." He looked to Stannis. "Lord Renly's fate can be decided by Lord Baratheon, he has earned at least that much. As for the others, kill them." Grand Maester Ulwick seemed particularly taken aback. "But your grace, they are prisoners of war." "Prisoners of war whom, if I allow to live, will continue to breed men with claims to castles they no longer possess. They have never learned of their folly in the past, and they will always keep coming back as long as they draw breath. The Golden Company has been a thorn in the Iron Throne's side for much too long. It ends now before they are once again plague shores with sword and fire. But none will dare attack again, your grace, not with the return of dragons. Perhaps. But where else would these men go but back to cesspools to further plot the downfall of the Targaryen dynasty? No, we kill them, all of them." Aegon turned and began striding from the room, head held high. Garth Greysteel's voice called after him. "That is what your uncle would have done, your grace." Aegon stopped for a moment before a great laugh escaped him. "Yes," the king said as he started forward again. "It is what my uncle would have done." Capital wasn't the same without him. Then again, very little was. Alysanne Lefford walked down a corridor of the Red Keep, the same castle she had once all but ruled as queen. The walls were the same as were the guards in Targaryen livery and the white of the Kingsguard. The same stench of sewage, the same crimson dragon banners. Aelor's balcony was still there, the view as glorious now as it had been when he'd first shown it to her. It was all the same, yet so much had changed. Aelor would tell her that it was simply the way of the world. She missed him every day. There was a new queen now, and soon there would be a new heir. That was why she was here after 3 years of being away, to pay homage to the new heir to the Iron Throne, both as his or her surrogate grandmother and as representative of his or her cousin, Lord Lucerys Targaryen of Duskendale. Aemma Arryn was the second queen of that name, married to Aegon a year and a half earlier. It had been a reward for the services House Arryn had rendered the Iron Throne during the latest wars. As well as for the key part Aemma herself had played in keeping the royal family in the safety of the Vale throughout both conflicts. The former handmaiden to Daenerys was righteous and honorable, not at all a fan of the man Aelor had been, but she had a mind for diplomacy, and had been quietly in love with Aegon since she had come to court at age 10. Alysanne didn't know if the king returned that love, doubted it, really. But then again, she and Aelor hadn't loved each other either, not at first. Perhaps the young rulers would learn as they had. The return to King's Landing was more than just a diplomatic trip, of course. It was good to see Aegon again. In Alysanne's mind, he looked more and more like Aelor every time she saw him. And of course Balon, her silent, grim Balon. His father would swell with pride at the sight of him in his white armor and cloak. He'd swell in pride at the young child braced on her hip too. Vaela Targaryen, silver of hair and violet of eye, had come screaming into the world 9 months after her father fell in the second battle for the Dawn. She was ferocious and fearless even as a baby, as physically exhausting of a child as any of Alysanne's brood. The region of Duskendale loved every minute of it, though she doubted anyone else did. Lucerys was growing at an absurd rate. His mother and both of his grandmothers, beautiful Cersei Lannister, influential Alysanne Lefford, wrapped around his chubby finger. He had a half-sibling on the way now, Miechella having remarried just shy of a year prior. Aelor Ricker had once been a lustful, boisterous young man, not to mention one of Ren's best friends. The wars had changed him, just as Alysanne was sure they would have changed her son if he had survived them. She once thought the now strong and stern Lord Ricker had married Miechella because he felt guilty that he had survived when Ren had not. But anymore she wasn't so sure that was the case. Whatever the reasons, his position as one of Lucary's bannermen allowed Mietshela to all but live at Duskendale with her son, and his support of the infant lord did much to solidify Lucary's reign. Lord Ricker was after all nephew of Lord Farlan of the Antlers, another of Lucary's bannermen, and young Lord Manfred Langward was the uncle of Lucary's himself. That left only the Byaches, and Lord Clayton seemed more than content to follow Aelor's grandson as he had once followed Aelor. Lucary's was safe, they were all safe. Alysanne thanked the Seven and Aelor every night. Aemon was lord of the Golden Tooth now. Alysanne's father Lord Leo had been ill since before the War of the Three Kings, and had passed 2 years past, leaving his daughter's eldest surviving son his lands. Aemon had been married at Duskendale a fortnight before moving west to his new home, wrapping a cloak with his new sigil, a green Targaryen dragon on a black field, around the shoulders of Shireen Baratheon. The banner for his cadet branch of House Targaryen was fitting. Aemon was, after all, dragon rider to regal. It had surprised them all. One morning Alysanne had awoken to find her quiet son, who was supposed to have been in King's Landing, sitting astride a dragon in the courtyard of the Dun Fort, the fiercest of smiles across his face. Daenerys and King Aegon had both soon arrived atop their own dragons, equal parts terrified and exhilarated for Regal and Aemon. It had been a laughter-filled, wonderful morning. Alysanne took a deep breath. It was good to be back in the capital. Despite the changes, there were many wonderful memories here too, even if many of those who had had a hand in making them were gone. Yeharys had gone north with the Starks a few months prior, riding to Duskendale to say goodbye before rejoining the massive train of returning Northerners. Spring had sprung, and while the air was still chilly and snow still covered much of Westeros, the roads were clear enough for Lord Brandon and his lords to finally return home. Val, the wildling woman Yeharys had married despite venomous protests from Aegon and the nobles, the two brothers had reputably come to blows over it twice, had been with the Wolf Prince, beautiful and decidedly pregnant. There were plans for keep to be raised near the ruins of the Wall, from whence Yeharys would control the lands north of it for House Stark. Alysanne knew he would thrive there. Much as it pained her for him to be so far away, Yeharys belonged in the lands of winter. The north was still overrun with dead bodies, and the cleanup of the Wall would take decades if not centuries, but it still belonged to the living. Yeharys had written that Lord Eddard's body had been found in the courtyard of his castle, one hand on ice, the other on the dagger he had thrust under his own chin. The Lord of the North had been mortally wounded in several places, and when it had come to an end had prevented himself from being able to be revivified. Ice was back in the hands of House Stark, and Lord Bran had the looks of a true ruler. The North would survive, as it had for millennia before the Targaryens and would for millennia after. Yeharys' decision to go north had meant Daemon, Alysanne's youngest son, was now the Lord of Summerhall. He would leave her in Duskendale in less than a year to take command of his new home. Dany was in King's Landing and the best dragon rider of all three, and Aegon was ruling as a king should. Rhaenys was pregnant again, she and Lord Willis already traveling to King's Landing to greet the coming prince or princess. Betrothal requests for Sarah and Alyssa were already coming in the dozens despite their young ages, and soon enough they would come for Vela as well. Her family was spreading out, her children starting to go their own way, but they were still her family. Aelor would have loved to have seen it all. Alysanne swore she would enjoy it double for them both. Lady Alysanne called a cheery voice, and she was already smiling as she turned. The time since the second battle for the Dawn had been good to Tyrion Lannister, the hand of the kingpin shining on the breast of his tunic. Tyrion smiled broadly as he made his way towards her, the expression mirrored on the face of his wife. Elinor Prester, the Shebel of Feastfires, was a sharp-tongued girl with unrivaled ambition. Her exploits in defending her home from the Ironborn, and then in helping to relieve many other Westerland holdings, had prompted Tyrion to offer her anything she wanted within his power. All she needed to do was name it. She had replied simply, "I wish to be the Lady of Casterly Rock." It had been what she wanted, it had been in Tyrion's power, and she had named it. Whatever they said of the halfman behind his back, he was a man of his word. While there was no love between the two, there was no hatred either, and Lady Elinor was respected across the region she was now lady of. Alysanne was happy for him. She and Tyrion had long been friends, and the dwarf was one Lannister whom Aelor hadn't hated with all of his heart. It was pleasing to see him with this manner of happiness. "Tyrion," Alysanne called in greeting, facing them as they neared. "I suppose you are both going the same direction as me." "Indeed, my lady," Tyrion said, shooting a silly grin at Vela in Alysanne's arms. "It is not every day that a new heir to the Iron Throne is born." Lady Elinor chimed in, glancing down at her husband in amusement. "Tyrion has been working towards this since he first pinned on the badge of hand of the king. I'm not sure which of them, he or King Aegon, are more excited." Tyrion held his hands out in exasperation even as he smirked. Convincing his grace to marry was more difficult than it should have ever been. I work for the security of the realm, and that security requires an heir. I will not feel ashamed." Alysanne laughed lightly. "Nor should you. This is a monumental day for us all." Others waited outside the birthing chamber throughout that long evening, the anticipation of a new heir heavy in the air. Lord Alessander Steedman gave both his greetings and his condolences, Lord Commander Arthur Dane doing the same. Aemon arrived, having ridden regal from the Golden Tooth on a whim. He took Vela from his mother's arms, playing with his youngest sibling as if he were a child of an equal age, eventually leaving the hallway to put her down for a nap. Daenerys went with him, the beautiful young dragon rider followed by a near army of suitors, Dany shooting her surrogate mother a good-natured eye-roll in the process. Balon relieved Sir Mitchell Redford of his post outside the birthing chamber, allowing Alysanne to fawn over him as she waited, Balon having grown taller than Ren or Aelor either one had been. Lord Ardes Arryn, his wife Margaery Tyrell and his mother Lysa arrived, Ardes fidgeting restlessly at his sister's screams from the birthing chamber, the Rose of the Reach finding his discomfort endearing. Tyrion took light-hearted bets on whether it would be a boy or a girl, Elinor reprimanding him. Varys slithered in and out as silent as a spider. Other lords and ladies arrived. Until soon the hall was overflowing and the midwives had to bodily force their way through the awaiting throng. Chills went up and down Alysanne's spine, and a flurry of excited squeals left the crowd when an infant's cry was heard from the birthing chamber. The king stepped out soon after, having insisted on being in the birthing chamber. That had made Alysanne smile. Aelor had always insisted on being there for their children too. Aegon had grown taller and more muscular in recent years, allowing a closely trimmed silver beard to grow, just as Aelor always had. His hair hung to his shoulders like a silvery waterfall, flowing out from the warlike crown of his ancestors Mikar I and Jaehaerys II. He stood straight and kingly, a broad smile on his face and a bundle held carefully in his arms. There were dozens of nobles Aegon could have gone to: Lysa, the infant's grandmother; Lord Ardes, his or her uncle; its cousin Aemon or its great-aunt Dany; even Tyrion, the man who had pestered Aegon to death over the need for the heir now in the king's arms. Instead, Aegon walked to Alysanne. "Mother," the king said as he gently came to a stop beside her, a violet-eyed, silver-haired infant staring out at her from the swaddles in his arms. "I would like you to meet the future king of the Iron Throne, Aelor Targaryen. From the writings of Aerion Targaryen, Grandmeister to his twin brother King Mikar Targaryen II, his nephew King Aegon VII and his great-nephew King Balon I, titled The Dragon of Duskendale. Written AC 400. History will not be kind to Aelor Targaryen. Grandmeister Calmer the Grey once wrote that you either loved him or you hated him, there was no middle ground. A century after his death, that statement still rings true. The second son of Aerys, the burner of Lannisport, the Dragon of Duskendale, was the son, brother, uncle and grandfather of kings. His youngest daughter, my grandmother Vela Targaryen, married his namesake, the firstborn son of King Aegon, 16 years after his death at the hands of the Night's King. From them the Targaryen dynasty has grown even more prolific than it was in the days of Aegon the Unlikely. In this humble scholar's opinion, that can be directly contributed to the Targaryen Prince of War. After his death, many men who once feigned friendship to the first Targaryen Lord of Duskendale would forsake him. Stories of his butchery, his fearsome rage, and his affinity for taking lives are known to all, from the highest noble to the lowest peasant. Even now he is widely considered a madman, a highly competent ruler, but also a cruel murderer who used his power to crush his enemies into oblivion. If one believes the stories, the Dragon of Duskendale himself never claimed to be anything less. Maybe those labels were earned, maybe they weren't, but somewhat lost in the horror of his atrocities is the greatness of his heroics. Accounts and stories written by the likes of Grandmeister Calmer, Lord Brandon Stark the Wise Wolf and Lord Samwell Tarly of the Westmark all agree that Aelor Targaryen fought all his life for his family, a family that he saved from extinction. If not for the Dragon of Duskendale, the Targaryen name would be a legend of old. Dragons would not fly the skies. King Aegon, forever known as the Promised, perhaps the greatest king Westeros has ever seen, greater even than his forefather Jaehaerys the Conciliator, would have been slaughtered as a babe. Perhaps Westeros wouldn't even exist as anything other than a ruined wasteland, overrun in the waves of others and whites that toppled the wall and nearly wiped out an entire generation of fighting men. We will never know what may have been, but we do know Aelor Targaryen played an important role in all that is. For every horror story there is a song, For every act of contempt, another act of reverence. King Aegon VI ruled for 50 years of peace after the Second Battle for the Dawn, only slightly interrupted by the cleansing of the Isles. Part of that was due to the fact that all of the regions had lost so many men in the War of the Three Kings and Second Battle for the Dawn that they couldn't wage war. Part of it was the rebirth of the dragons. But most of it was the fact that Aegon was a wise, just ruler who would attribute the man he was to the uncle who could have usurped him. King Aegon did, as all know, name his heir after the dragon of Duskendale, though that Aelor Targaryen never became king. He died of an ailment of the heart at the age of 48, followed in death by his heartbroken father less than a fortnight later. His own son and my father, King Jaehaerys III, would succeed the promised as king of the Iron Throne. Jaehaerys told me stories about the White Dragon since the day I was born. Those stories having been told to him by King Aegon and Lord Commander Balon Blooddragon of the Kingsguard. They spoke of skill at arms, of vicious retribution, and of a dragon-made man. The songs A Dragon's Wrath and Dancing with the Sun were written about the lighting of the lions and the rumored love of Aelor and Aelia Mardell, respectively. Thundering hooves, glinting steel glorifies his charge across the Ruby Ford at the First Battle of the Trident. Plays of his life, some flattering and most not, are performed in all 8 regions and across Essos. Duskendale, now home to a secondary branch of House Targaryen that rivals even the Lord Paramounts in wealth and influence, thrived under the supposed Butcher. The scarred helm and its white flame crest are still displayed in the Dun Fort alongside the ruby pommel of the shattered blade that claimed so many lives, placed there by Aelor's grandson Lucerys Targaryen. His children, both in blood and in spirit, helped solidify Targaryen ties to the other regions of Westeros and to previously rebellious factions. Though his eldest son, Renlar Targaryen, would die at the Second Battle of the Trident, Renlar's own son, the aforementioned Lucerys, would marry Daenella Waters, his cousin and the daughter of Viserys the Betrayer. His shrewd mind and charming nature would later see him appointed hand of the king to Kings Aegon, Jaehaerys and Mikar, a position he would hold for 36 years until the day of his death. Aemon Targaryen, Lord of the Golden Tooth and first dragon rider of Regal, would marry the only daughter of Lord Stannis Baratheon, the grayscale survivor Shireen. He served Lord Tyrion Lannister faithfully until the Halfman's death, the Giant of Lannister fostering his heir Jaime with Aemon the Scholar, and doing much to repair the once-tattered Targaryen-Lannister relations. Lord Jaime would later marry Aemon's daughter Rhaella, further strengthening Targaryen rule in the Westerlands. Balon Blooddragon would serve in Aegon's and Jaehaerys' Kingsguards, eventually rising to Lord Commander. Considered both as deadly and as erratic as his father had been, Aelor's third son was as loyal and dedicated a Kingsguard as ever lived, even if honor was never his foremost attribute. He would die defending King Jaehaerys from the assassins of a slighted lord, while the king was hunting in the first year of his reign, slaying all 4 before he succumbed to his wounds. Daemon Targaryen, Lord of Summerhall and a child during the War of Three Kings and the Second Battle for the Dawn, would, like his eldest sister Rhaella, suffer a tragic end. At the age of 22 he was slain in a jousting accident against his brother Balon. His wife Dina, the other and elder child of Viserys the Betrayer, would give birth to a daughter named Visera 4 months after his death. Visera would serve as the Lady of Summerhall after him, later marrying Aegon's second and final son Vikar. Lady Sarah Targaryen lives in Winterfell to this very day, great-grandmother to the current Lord Benjen Stark, and only living person to have ever seen the Dragon of Duskendale in the flesh. At 100 her mind often roams, and the memories she had of her father have long been lost, though the few fuzzy recollections she had when she could recall them were included in the writing of her husband, the Wise Wolf. Alyssa Targaryen would marry future Lord Steffon Baratheon of the Stormlands, dying at 27 of complications from the birth of her 4th child, the future Lord Orys Roman II. It is widely believed that her death was the final blow for Aelor's wife Alysanne Lefford, the surrogate mother of King Aegon. The universally respected Westerwoman would join her husband and 4 of her children in death less than a year later, passing away in the Dun Fort of Duskendale of a broken heart. The whole of Westeros grieved her passing, and as per her wishes she was interred in the Sept of Baelor alongside the ashes of her husband and 2 eldest. The final of Prince Aelor's and Lady Alysanne's children, born 9 moons after the former's death, would birth a future king and advise him until her own death at the age of 50. Rhaella Targaryen was considered smart and beautiful, though stories would carry through the years of her vicious disposition and penchant for ruthlessly dealing with offenders. She was every bit the daughter of the father she never met, Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, the niece Aelor so loved, and who was rumored after his death to actually be his ill-conceived daughter, though I myself believe that false. would be the Lady of Highgarden, giving Lord Willis Tyrell 3 sons and an olive-skinned daughter. A daughter who would be named Aelora in honor of the dragon of Duskendale. Aelora Tyrell would prove her Valyrian heritage, be it through Rhaegar or Aelor, when she would become the second dragon rider of Rhaegal after Lord Aemon's death, much to the consternation of Princes Aelor and Vikar. Neither would ever bond with a dragon, though King Jaehaerys would ride Balerion after the death of his grandfather. Prince Jaehaerys Targaryen, namesake of my father and always more wolf than dragon, would spend the rest of his days in the north, traveling south less than a dozen times for the remainder of his life. House Targaryen of the New North shares very few similarities with its southern counterparts. Valyrian features rarely crop up in their children, and the house began worshipping the old gods not far into Jaehaerys' reign. The way of life is different there than it is in the south and even in the Old North, but the former wildlings who inhabit the forests and glaciers obey the descendants of Jaehaerys, and they have since the Second Battle for the Dawn fought as ferociously for the King of the Iron Throne as they ever did a king beyond the wall. And then there is the dragon of Duskendale's sister, the Silver Princess Daenerys Stormborn. The first dragon rider of Aelin and hero of the Second Battle for the Dawn, would rise to become perhaps the most powerful woman who wasn't a queen in Westerosi history, even more powerful than her surrogate mother Alysanne. She was a trusted advisor of King Aegon in matters of diplomacy, and while she would only ever ride the white dragon Aelin, all 3 of the beasts and their subsequent hatchlings would show a particular affinity for the mother of dragons. She would marry the youngest son of Lord Ardrian Celtigar, Sir Melwys, who carried his house's Valyrian steel axe during the Second Battle for the Dawn and every day thereafter. Melwys was a strong man and fair of face, yet also quiet and gentle. Daenerys reputedly chose him more for his poetry and courtly manner than for his Valyrian heritage or skill at arms. Their marriage was a matrilineal one, all 4 of their children belonging to House Targaryen. Aegon would appoint her to the small council as a personal advisor, the first woman to serve on the ruling council of the 7 kingdoms in a permanent capacity when not a regent or queen, and the mother of dragons would spend her entire life in King's Landing. The royal coffers overflowed under Aelor's care. Trade between Westeros and the free cities increased by large margins. The right of agnatic primogeniture, the succession law Westeros was built upon, was honored. 2 rebellions were crushed, and the worst threat to ever plague the Targaryen dynasty themselves was twice defeated. These are only stories and artifacts, of course, though the logistical and familial statements are accurate. Who truly knows what Aelor Targaryen was honestly like as a man? Lady Sarah was 2 name days old when her father rode off to war, and Lady Alyssa wasn't even 1. Renlyr and Rhaella would die in that war. Dowager Queen Vaela would never know him. Balin Blooddragon and Daemon were not fond of writing, and Aemon the scholar's works were ones of a son about his dead father, and have had their nature called into question, though it is only fair to mention that his accounts paint Aelor in a much different light. I am not writing this to defend my great-grandfather. For all this Meister knows he was every bit as mad as the worst rumors claim he was. But as a scholar, I seek to teach the truth, and the truth is that Aelor Targaryen, whatever his many faults, is as important a figure in the history of Westeros as any king of any house. His atrocities were great, but so were his achievements. He helped build the modern Targaryen dynasty, reshaping Westeros along the way. He wiped out entire houses and burned prosperous cities to the ground. Yet he also spared thousands of innocents and didn't usurp an infant when most of Westeros wished him to. The Dragon of Duskendale was truly a man of extremes, both positive and negative, and those extremes would shape the future of an entire continent. No, history will not be kind to Aelor Targaryen. But without him, nothing in this life would be the same.